Welcome back to our podcast, powered by the wonderful team at Jet AI, they're the ones who make sure our audio is as smooth as a Malawian sunset over Lake Malawi.
Yeah. And speaking of sunsets, have you guys heard about the time I tried to recreate one in my kitchen with a toaster and a bunch of kitchen utensils? Let's just say it was a bit of a fiery display.
Oh, Leo, you always know how to make us laugh. But seriously, we've got a great episode for you today. We're talking about two amazing countries, Malawi and Uruguay. And trust me, you're going to want to hear about them.
That's right, Mira, and I'm to share our expertise with you all. We've got a whole list of questions that we'll be answering today, from safety and economy to education and nightlife. So, grab a snack, get comfy, and let's dive in.
Now, I have to ask, Leo, what's the most ridiculous thing you've done since our last podcast? You always seem to find a way to get into trouble.
Well, Mira, I did try to cook a traditional Malawian dish called nsima. It's like a cornmeal porridge. But let's just say it didn't exactly turn out as planned. I ended up with a kitchen full of smoke and a batch of nsima that looked more like, well, like something you might find in a science experiment.
Oh no. Leo, I'm sure it was a real challenge to cook. But we're here to talk about Malawi and Uruguay today. So, let's get started. And don't worry, we won't make you cook any nsima along the way.
Thanks for the warning, Mira. So, Malawi and Uruguay, what's the main difference between these two countries? Why should we care about them?
Well, Leo, Malawi is a small country in southeastern Africa, known for its beautiful lakes, mountains, and wildlife. And Uruguay, on the other hand, is a country in South America, famous for its beautiful coastline, rolling hills, and vibrant culture.
That's right, Mira. And both countries have a lot to offer when it comes to tourism, culture, and lifestyle. But what about the more serious stuff like safety and economy? How do they compare?
Oh, great question. Leo, we'll be covering all of that and more today. From the cost of living to the quality of healthcare. We'll be diving into all the details you need to know to make an informed decision about which country is right for you.
And don't worry, folks will be taking a comprehensive approach to this comparison. We'll be looking at everything from the job market to the nightlife scene, so you can get a well-rounded picture of what it's like to live in each country.
That's right, Leo, and we're to share our expertise with you all. So, let's get started and see what we can learn about Malawi and Uruguay.
Sounds good to me, Mira. And remember, folks, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. We'd love to hear from you.
Dive into the world of general safety and crime rates in Malawi and Uruguay. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to a country where you felt like you were in a war zone?
Well, Mira, I've been to some sketchy places, but I think Malawi is generally a safe country. You just have to be aware of your surroundings, especially at night.
That's true. And speaking of surroundings, I've heard that Malawi has a low crime rate compared to other African countries. But what about Uruguay? I've read that it's one of the safest countries in South America.
Yeah, Uruguay has a reputation for being very safe, especially for tourists. In fact, it's often ranked as one of the safest countries in the world.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners living in Uruguay would agree with me that it's a wonderful place to visit. But what about Malawi? Are there any specific areas that tourists should avoid?
Well, Mira, there are some areas in Malawi that are considered high risk, such as the border regions with Mozambique and Zambia. But overall, the country is generally safe for tourists.
I see. And what about petty crime? Like pickpocketing or scams? Are there any areas where tourists should be particularly vigilant?
Yes. Petty crime is a problem in both Malawi and Uruguay. But I think Uruguay is a bit more prone to it. Tourists should always be mindful of their belongings, especially in crowded areas.
That's great advice. Leah, And speaking of crowded areas, I've heard that Uruguay has some of the most vibrant cities in South America. Have you ever been to Montevideo?
Oh, Mira, I have been to Montevideo, and it's a fantastic city. The energy is electric, and the people are so friendly.
I bet. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experiences in Montevideo. But what about Malawi? Are there any cultural factors that contribute to its relatively low crime rate?
Yes. I think one of the main reasons Malawi has a low crime rate is its strong sense of community. People look out for each other, and there's a general sense of respect for one another.
That's beautiful, Leo. And I think that's something that Uruguay also values highly. In fact, Uruguay has a strong tradition of social solidarity, which helps to reduce crime rates.
Exactly. And I think that's something that both Malawi and Uruguay can learn from each other. Maybe we can even have a podcast episode on cultural exchange between the two countries.
That's a great idea. Leo, and speaking of cultural exchange, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this topic. Do you think that cultural factors play a bigger role in shaping crime rates than economic factors?
That's a tough question. Mira, I think it's a bit of both. Actually, economic factors can contribute to crime rates, but cultural factors can also play a big role in shaping attitudes towards crime.
I see what you mean. And I think that's something that our listeners can relate to. After all, who hasn't heard of the old saying, money can't buy happiness?
Exactly. And I think that's something that both Malawi and Uruguay can learn from each other. Maybe we can even have a podcast episode on happiness and well-being in these two countries.
That's a great idea. And speaking of well-being, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the healthcare systems in Malawi and Uruguay. Do you think that's something we should cover in our next episode?
Yes. I think that's a great idea. Mira, the healthcare systems in both countries are actually quite interesting. And I think our listeners would find it fascinating to learn more about them.
Well, there you have it, folks. A brief look at the general safety and crime rates in Malawi and Uruguay. I'm sure our listeners have learned a thing or two about these two fascinating countries.
And I'm sure our listeners are now wondering which country is safer. Well, I think the answer is clear: both countries are generally safe. But Uruguay is a bit more prone to petty crime.
Well, there you have it. And if you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more exciting episodes like this one.
And if you want to learn more about Malawi and Uruguay, be sure to check out our next episode on healthcare systems in these two countries.
And finally, thanks for tuning into our podcast. Folks, we'll be back with more exciting episodes soon.
And until then, stay safe and keep on exploring these two wonderful countries. Dive into the world of politics and social harmony in Malawi and Uruguay. I'm to share with you the unique dynamics of each country.
That's right. Mira, both countries have their own distinct ways of governing and fostering community relationships. I'm curious to see how they compare.
Well, let's start with Malawi. From what I've researched, it seems that Malawi has a relatively stable government, with a president serving as the head of state.
Yes. And Uruguay, on the other hand, has a unique system of governance, with a president and a parliament. But what's interesting is that Uruguay has a strong tradition of direct democracy, where citizens have a significant say in decision-making processes.
I love that. Direct democracy is such an important aspect of Uruguay's governance, and I'm sure our listeners living in Uruguay would agree with me that it's a key factor in maintaining social harmony.
Absolutely. And Malawi, while it has its own challenges, has made significant strides in promoting social harmony through its community-based initiative.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on community involvement in decision-making processes. But what I find fascinating is how they approach conflict resolution.
Yes. Uruguay's approach to conflict resolution is indeed unique. It has a strong focus on mediation and dialogue, which helps to resolve conflicts in a peaceful and constructive manner.
That's so true. And Malawi, while it has its own challenges, has also made significant strides in promoting conflict resolution through its traditional justice systems.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that direct democracy is the key to maintaining social harmony? Or do you have other ideas?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. Really, direct democracy can be a powerful tool for promoting social harmony, but it also requires a strong sense of community and civic engagement.
I see what you mean. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have made significant efforts to promote civic engagement and community involvement in decision-making processes.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on education and cultural exchange, which helps to promote social harmony and understanding.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of community-based initiatives, which helps to promote social harmony and community development.
Exactly. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of cultural identity and tradition, which helps to promote social harmony and community cohesion.
Yes. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in promoting social harmony through their cultural events and festivals.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on community-based tourism, which helps to promote social harmony and community development.
Yes. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of community-based conservation efforts, which helps to promote social harmony and environmental sustainability.
Exactly. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of civic engagement and community involvement in decision-making processes.
Yes. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have made significant strides in promoting social harmony through their community-based initiatives.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our discussion on political stability and social harmony in Malawi and Uruguay.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a lot to offer when it comes to promoting social harmony and community development.
For more insights like this, don't forget to check out Jetloff AI, where you can explore more in-depth analysis and data-driven insights on Malawi and Uruguay.
And if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us in the comments section. We'd love to hear from you.
And as always, thank you for tuning into our podcast. We'll be back soon with more exciting topics and discussions.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. See you next time.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever thought about what makes a country's economy tick? I mean, what are the key factors that determine whether a country is a great place to live and work?
Mira, I've been to my fair share of countries, but I've never really thought about it that way. But now that you mention it, I think it's all about the job market, right? A strong economy is all about creating jobs and opportunities for its citizens.
Exactly. And that's where Malawi comes in. They have a growing economy, driven by agriculture, tourism, and mining. But what's interesting is that they're also working on diversifying their economy to reduce their dependence on a single industry.
That's a great point. Mira, and speaking of job markets, I've heard that Uruguay has a very strong economy, with a high standard of living and a low poverty rate. They're also known for their stable democracy and good governance.
Yes, that's true. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about Uruguay is their approach to economic development. They're all about creating a more equitable society, where everyone has access to the same opportunities.
I see what you mean. And it's not just about the economy, is it? It's also about the culture and the way of life. I mean, have you ever been to a Malawian market? It's like a whole different world.
Oh, yes. The markets in Malawi are amazing, and the people are so friendly and welcoming. But, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There are definitely challenges when it comes to the economy in Malawi.
I'm sure there are. But, I think that's what makes it so interesting. The fact that they're working to overcome those challenges and create a better future for themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that our listeners can learn from. I mean, if you're moving to Malawi or Uruguay, You need to be aware of the economic realities on the ground.
That's right. And it's not just about the economy. It's also about the cost of living. I mean, how much is it going to cost you to live in each country?
Well, that's a great question. And actually, I think that's something that our listeners can help us with. If you're living in Malawi or Uruguay, can you give us an idea of what the cost of living is like in each country?
Ah, great idea. Mira, I'm sure our listeners would be happy to share their experiences.
And, it's not just about the cost of living. It's also about the quality of life. What kind of amenities do you have access to in each country? Are there good healthcare options? Education options?
Absolutely. And, I think that's something that Uruguay does really well. They have a great public healthcare system, and education is highly valued.
That's true. And, actually, I think that's one of the things that I admire most about Uruguay. They seem to really prioritize the well-being of their citizens.
I agree. And, I think that's something that Malawi is also working towards. They're making efforts to improve their healthcare system and education options.
Exactly. And, I think that's something that our listeners can learn from. I mean, if you're moving to a new country, you need to think about what kind of quality of life you want.
That's right. And, I think that's why it's so important to do your research and visit each country before making a decision.
Absolutely. And, I think that's something that our listeners can help us with. If you've visited Malawi or Uruguay, can you give us some tips on what to do and see in each country?
Ah, great idea. Mira, I'm sure our listeners would be happy to share their experiences.
And it's not just about the economy and the cost of living. It's also about the culture and the way of life. What kind of traditions and customs do you experience in each country?
Ah, that's a great question, Mira. And, I think that's something that Uruguay does really well. They have a rich cultural heritage and a strong sense of tradition.
That's true. And, actually, I think that's one of the things that I admire most about Uruguay. They seem to really value their cultural heritage.
I agree. And, I think that's something that Malawi is also working towards. They're making efforts to preserve their cultural heritage and pass it down to future generations.
Exactly. And, I think that's something that our listeners can learn from. I mean, if you're moving to a new country, you need to think about what kind of culture and way of life you want.
That's right. And, I think that's why it's so important to do your research and visit each country before making a decision.
And, I think that's something that our listeners can help us with. If you visited Malawi or Uruguay, can you give us some tips on what to do and see in each country?
Great idea. Mira, I'm sure our listeners would be happy to share their experiences.
And it's not just about the economy and the cost of living. It's also about the people. What kind of people do you meet in each country? Are they friendly and welcoming?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, and, I think that's something that Uruguay does really well. They have a reputation for being one of the friendliest countries in the world.
That's true. And, actually, I think that's one of the things that I admire most about Uruguay. They seem to really value their people and their relationships.
I agree. And, I think that's something that Malawi is also working towards. They're making efforts to improve their relationships with their neighbors and the international community.
Exactly. And, I think that's something that our listeners can learn from. I mean, if you are moving to a new country, you need to think about what kind of people you want to surround yourself with.
That's right. And, I think that's why it's so important to do your research and visit each country before making a decision.
And I think that's something that our listeners can help us with. If you visited Malawi or Uruguay, can you give us some tips on what to do and see in each country? So, Let's talk about accommodation options and quality in Malawi and Uruguay. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever stayed in a Malawian village and experienced the local way of life?
Actually, Mira, I have. It was an incredible experience. The villagers were so warm and welcoming. They even offered me a traditional meal of an SMA, which is a staple food in Malawi. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it.
That's great. Leo, NSMA is indeed a fascinating part of Malawian culture. But let's get back to accommodation options in Malawi. I've heard that guest houses and lodges are becoming increasingly popular, especially among tourists.
That's right. Mira, Malawi has a rich tourism industry, and many guest houses and lodges offer a comfortable and affordable stay for visitors. But what about Uruguay? Mira, what can our listeners expect from the housing market there?
Well, Leo, Uruguay has a relatively high standard of living, and the housing market reflects that. Many expats and locals alike opt for apartments or houses in the capital city, Montevideo, which offers a great quality of life.
That's true. Mira, but what about the affordability of housing in Uruguay? I've heard that it's relatively expensive, especially in Montevideo.
Yes, Leo, that's correct. Uruguay has a relatively high cost of living, and housing is no exception. However, many expats find that the benefits of living in Uruguay, such as the relaxed pace of life and the beautiful coastline, make it well worth the investment.
I see what you mean. Mira, and what about Malawi? Mira, what are some of the pros and cons of renting or buying a property there?
Well, Leo, Malawi has a relatively low cost of living, which makes it an attractive option for expats on a budget. However, the housing market can be quite competitive, especially in popular areas like Lilange.
That's right. Mira, and what about the quality of housing in Malawi? I've heard that some properties can be quite basic, especially in rural areas.
Yes, Leo, that's true. Many expats and locals have invested in modernizing their properties, and there are some beautiful homes to be found in Malawi, especially in areas like Blanta.
I'm curious. Mira, what are some of the unique features of Malawian architecture? I've heard that traditional homes are made from local materials like wood and thatch.
That's right. Leo, Malawian architecture is indeed unique and reflects the country's rich cultural heritage. Traditional homes are often made from local materials, and many expats have adopted this style when building their own homes in Malawi.
I see what you mean. Mira, and what about Uruguay? Mira, what are some of the unique features of Uruguayan architecture?
Well, Leo, Uruguay has a rich history of European immigration, and this is reflected in the country's architecture. Many buildings, especially in Montevideo, have a colonial or Art Deco style, which adds to the city's charm.
That's true. Mira, and what about the cost of living in Uruguay? Mira, I've heard that it's relatively high, especially in Montevideo.
Yes, Leo, that's correct. Uruguay has a relatively high cost of living, and housing is no exception. Many expats find that the benefits of living in Uruguay, such as the relaxed pace of life and the beautiful coastline, make it well worth the investment.
I see what you mean. Mira, and what about the quality of life in Uruguay? Mira, I've heard that it's relatively high, especially in areas like Montevideo.
That's right. Leo, Uruguay has a high standard of living, and many expats and locals alike enjoy a great quality of life in the country.
I'm curious. Mira, what are some of the pros and cons of living in Malawi versus Uruguay? Our listeners might be wondering which country is better suited to their needs.
Well, Leo, it ultimately depends on what our listeners are looking for. If they want a more affordable and relaxed pace of life, Malawi might be the better option. If they're looking for a more modern and urban lifestyle, Uruguay might be the better choice.
That's a great point. Mira, and what about the expat community in Malawi and Uruguay? Mira, I've heard that both countries have a growing expat community.
Yes, Leo, that's true. Both Malawi and Uruguay have a growing expat community, and many expats have found a sense of community and belonging in both countries.
I see what you mean. Mira, and what about the language barrier? Mira, I've heard that English is widely spoken in both countries, but there may be some language difficulties for non-native speakers.
That's right. Leo, while English is widely spoken in both countries, there may still be some language difficulties for non-native speakers. However, many expats have found that the locals are generally very friendly and willing to help.
I'm curious. Mira, what are some of the unique cultural experiences that our listeners can expect in Malawi and Uruguay?
Well, Leo, both countries have a rich cultural heritage, and our listeners can expect to experience many unique cultural traditions and customs during their stay.
I see what you mean. Mira, and what about the food? Mira, I've heard that Malawi is a delicious traditional cuisine, especially when it comes to dishes like ensima and dumsho.
That's right. Leo, Malawian cuisine is indeed delicious and features many traditional dishes like ensima and dumsho. And Uruguay has its own unique cuisine, especially when it comes to dishes like caibito and tortas efaritas.
I'm curious. Mira, what are some of the unique features of Malawian and Uruguayan cuisine? Our listeners might be wondering what to expect when they try local dishes.
Well, Leo, Malawian cuisine is known for its hearty and flavorful dishes, especially when it comes to traditional meals like ensima and dumsho. And Uruguayan cuisine has its own unique blend of European and Latin American flavors, especially when it comes to dishes like caibito and tortas efaritas.
I see what you mean. Mira, and what about the nightlife in Malawi and Uruguay? Mira, I've heard that both countries have a lively nightlife scene.
That's right. Leo, both Malawi and Uruguay have a lively nightlife scene, with many bars and clubs to choose from.
I'm curious. Mira, what are some of the unique features of the nightlife scene in Malawi and Uruguay?
Tied into the world of visas, immigration, and official procedures in Malawi and Uruguay. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever navigated the bureaucracy in either country?
Well, Mira, I've had my fair share of dealing with visas in various countries. But I must say, Malawi and Uruguay have their own unique approaches. In Malawi, the process is relatively straightforward, but the paperwork can be overwhelming. I've heard that the Malawian government has made efforts to simplify the process for expats. But it's still a challenge.
That's interesting. I've been told that Uruguay, on the other hand, has a more streamlined process, with a focus on ease of access for tourists and expats. But I've also heard that the bureaucracy can be quite slow, and it's not uncommon for applications to take months to process.
Yes, that's true. I've heard that Uruguay's government had various measures to make the process more efficient, such as online applications and expedited processing for certain types of visas. But, as you said, the pace can be glacial, and it's not uncommon for applicants to experience delays.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Malawi would agree with me when I say that the process can be frustrating. But it's worth it in the end. After all, the beautiful landscapes and friendly people of Malawi make it a wonderful place to call home.
Absolutely. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners in Uruguay would agree that the country's relaxed atmosphere and stunning coastline make it a great place to live. But let's get back to the topic at hand, the ease of visa and immigration procedures. Have you heard about the new e-visa system that's been introduced in Malawi?
Yes, I've heard about it. From what I understand, the e-visa system is designed to make it easier for tourists and expats to obtain visas, and it's been well received by the international community. But I've also heard that there are some issues with the system, such as technical glitches and delays in processing.
That's right. Mira, I've heard that the e-visa system is still in its infancy, and there are some kinks to be worked out. But overall, it's a step in the right direction, and it's definitely made the process more convenient for many people.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever had to deal with the Malawian immigration authorities? I've heard that they can be quite, let's say, enthusiastic in their approach to enforcing the law.
Ah, yes. I've had my fair share of dealings with the Malawian immigration authorities. But, I must say, they're generally quite friendly and helpful. Of course, there are always a few individuals who might be more enthusiastic than others. But overall, they are a great bunch of people.
I'm sure our listeners would appreciate your diplomatic response, Leo. But, seriously, have you heard about the new immigration regulations in Uruguay? I've heard that they're making it easier for expats to obtain residency.
Ah, yes. I've heard about the new regulations. From what I understand, Uruguay is making a concerted effort to attract more expats and tourists. And the new regulations are designed to make it easier for people to obtain residency. It's a great move, and I'm sure it will have a positive impact on the country's economy.
That's terrific, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the update. So, let's summarize. Malawi's e-visa system is still in its infancy, but it's a step in the right direction. While Uruguay's new immigration regulations are making it easier for expats to obtain residency. And, of course, both countries have their own unique approaches to bureaucracy. But overall, they're both great places to live.
Well said, Mira. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for your insights. Mira, it's been enlightening to discuss these of visa, immigration, and official procedures in Malawi and Uruguay with you.
The pleasure's all mine, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the information. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us in the comments section below. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode. Dive into the healthcare system of Malawi and Uruguay. I'm to share my findings with you all. Malawi has made significant strides in improving access to healthcare, especially in rural areas. With the introduction of community-based health workers, they've been able to reach more people and provide essential services.
That's great to hear, Mira. However, I've heard that the quality of care in Malawi can be inconsistent. Have you come across any stories about patients experiencing difficulties in accessing quality healthcare?
Yes. I've seen some concerning reports about the lack of resources and infrastructure in some rural areas. But, on the other hand, I've also spoken to expats who have had positive experiences with the healthcare system in Malawi. They've praised the kindness and dedication of the medical staff.
That's good to know. In Uruguay, I've learned that they have a well-organized and well-funded healthcare system. The government has implemented a universal healthcare model, which ensures that everyone has access to quality care, regardless of their income or social status.
That's fantastic. Uruguay's healthcare system is definitely a model for other countries to follow. But, I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the challenges that Malawi faces in terms of healthcare infrastructure? I've read that they're struggling to maintain and upgrade their hospitals and clinics.
Ah, yes. I've heard about that. It's a major issue, but I've also learned that the government is working to address it. They're investing in new infrastructure and training more healthcare professionals. It's a complex issue, but I'm optimistic that they'll make progress.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare experiences of expats in Uruguay. Have you spoken to any expats who have moved to Uruguay for work or retirement?
Actually, yes, I have. And they've all reported being very happy with the healthcare system in Uruguay. They praise the quality of care, the availability of services, and the friendliness of the medical staff. It's clear that Uruguay has a strong healthcare system that supports the well-being of its citizens.
Well, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would agree that having access to quality healthcare is essential for a happy and healthy life. In Malawi, I've learned that the government is working to improve the healthcare system through initiatives like the Malawi Health Equity Fund. Can you tell us more about that? Leo?
Yes. I've heard about that initiative. It's a great effort to address the health inequities in Malawi. The fund provides financial support to vulnerable populations, including pregnant women and children under 5. It's a vital program that helps ensure that everyone has access to quality health care. regardless of their economic status.
That's amazing. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare experiences of expats in Malawi. Have you spoken to any expats who have moved to Malawi for work or adventure?
Actually, yes, I have. And they've all reported being very happy with the healthcare system in Malawi. They praise the kindness and dedication of the medical staff, and they've had positive experiences with the quality of care. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are challenges in the healthcare system, but overall, they're very pleased with the care they've received.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would agree that having access to quality healthcare is essential for a happy and healthy life. In Uruguay, I've learned that the government has implemented aims to promote health and well-being, including programs to reduce childhood obesity and improve mental health services. Can you tell us more about those initiatives? Leo?
Yes. I've heard about those initiatives. They're great examples of Uruguay's commitment to promoting health and well-being. The programs to reduce childhood obesity are particularly impressive, as they address the root causes of the issue, such as lack of access to healthy food and physical activity.
That's fantastic. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare experiences of expats in Uruguay. Have you spoken to any expats who have moved to Uruguay for work or retirement?
Actually, yes, I have. And they've all reported being very happy with the healthcare system in Uruguay. They praise the quality of care, the availability of services, and the friendliness of the medical staff. It's clear that Uruguay has a strong healthcare system that supports the well-being of its citizens.
Well, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would agree that having access to quality healthcare is essential for a happy and healthy life. In Malawi, I've learned that the government is working to improve the healthcare system through initiatives like the Malawi Health Equity Fund. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. I've heard about that initiative. It's a great effort to address the health inequities in Malawi. The fund provides financial support to vulnerable populations, including pregnant women and children under 5. It's a vital program that helps ensure that everyone has access to quality healthcare, regardless of their economic status.
That's amazing. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare experiences of expats in Malawi. Have you spoken to any expats who have moved to Malawi for work or adventure?
Actually, yes, I have. And they've all reported being very happy with the healthcare system in Malawi. They praise the kindness and dedication of the medical staff, and they've had positive experiences with the quality of care. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are challenges in the healthcare system, but overall, they're pleased with the care they've received.
Well, it looks like both Malawi and Uruguay have made significant strides in improving access to healthcare. But I have to ask, Leo, what do you think is the key to a successful healthcare system?
That's a great question. Mira, I think the key to a successful healthcare system is a combination of factors, including strong infrastructure, well-trained medical staff, and a commitment to equity and access. But I also think that cultural factors play a big role in shaping the healthcare experience.
That's a great point. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would agree that cultural factors can greatly impact the healthcare experience. And speaking of cultural factors, I've learned that Uruguay has a unique approach to healthcare, which emphasizes prevention and community-based care. Can you tell us more about that? Leo?
Yes. I've heard about that approach. It's a great example of Uruguay's commitment to promoting health and well-being. The emphasis on prevention and community-based care is particularly impressive, as it addresses the root causes of health issues and promotes a sense of community and social connection.
That's fantastic. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the healthcare experiences of expats in Uruguay. Have you spoken? Let's dive into transportation infrastructure and convenience in Malawi and Uruguay. I bet our listeners in these countries can relate to our conversation. Leo, have you ever navigated the roads in Malawi?
Yes. The roads in Malawi can be quite a challenge. I once took a bus from Lillian to Blantyre, and let's just say it was an adventure. The roads were bumpy, and the bus was packed, but the views of the surrounding countryside were breathtaking.
Breathtaking. Indeed. I've heard that Malawi's public transportation system is quite affordable. But it can be slow. Have you ever taken a Matola? Leo?
Ah, yes. The Matola is a popular mode of transportation in Malawi. It's a minibus that's usually overcrowded and often driven recklessly. But it's a great way to experience the local culture.
I bet that's an experience. In Uruguay, the public transportation system is quite efficient. Have you ever taken a bus in Montevideo? Leo?
Ah, yes. The buses in Montevideo are modern and well maintained. They're also quite affordable, and the routes are extensive. I was impressed by the efficiency of the system.
Efficiency is key when it comes to transportation. I've heard that Uruguay's roads are generally in good condition, but there are some areas that can be quite congested. Have you ever driven in Montevideo? Leo?
Ah, yes. Driving in Montevideo can be a challenge, especially during rush hour. The roads can be congested, but the drivers are generally polite and courteous.
Polite drivers are always a plus. I've also heard that Malawi has a well-developed network of railways. Have you ever taken a train in Malawi?
Ah, yes. The railway system in Malawi is quite extensive, and it's a great way to see the countryside. However, the trains can be slow, and the service can be unreliable.
Unreliable service is always a concern. In Uruguay, the railway system is also quite developed, but it's more geared towards freight transport. Have you ever taken a train in Uruguay? Leo?
Ah, yes. I took a train from Montevideo to Colonia del Sacramento, and it was a beautiful ride. The train runs along the coast, and the scenery is stunning.
Stunning scenery is always a bonus. I've also heard that Malawi has a well-developed network of airfields. Have you ever flown in Malawi? Leo?
Ah, yes. Malawi has a number of small airfields that are used for domestic flights. However, the flights can be expensive, and the service can be limited.
Limited service can be a problem. In Uruguay, the airports are generally well maintained, and the service is quite good. Have you ever flown in Uruguay? Leo?
Ah, yes. I flew from Montevideo to Buenos Aires, and it was a smooth ride. The airport in Montevideo is modern and efficient.
Efficiency is key when it comes to air travel. I've also heard that Malawi has a well-developed network of bus stations. Have you ever used a bus station in Malawi? Leo?
Ah, yes. The bus stations in Malawi are usually crowded and chaotic, but they're an important hub for public transportation. I've used a number of bus stations during my travels in Malawi.
Chaotic bus stations can be overwhelming. In Uruguay, the bus stations are generally modern and well organized. Have you ever used a bus station in Uruguay? Leo?
Ah, yes. The bus stations in Uruguay are quite efficient, and they're a great place to catch a bus or grab a snack. I was impressed by the cleanliness and organization of the bus stations.
Cleanliness and organization are essential when it comes to transportation. I think that's all the time we have for today's topic. Thanks for sharing your experiences. Leo?
Thanks. Lyra, it was a pleasure discussing transportation infrastructure and convenience in Malawi and Uruguay.
I bet our listeners in these countries can relate to our conversation. If you've got a better transit hack, drop a comment below. What do you all think about this? Tell us below.
And remember, if you're planning a trip to Malawi or Uruguay, be prepared for some bumpy roads and chaotic bus stations. But also be sure to take in the stunning scenery and efficient public transportation systems.
Tom, let's dive into the language barrier and ease of communication in Malawi and Uruguay. I'm curious. Leo, how do you think the language landscape differs between these two countries?
Well, Mira, from what I've observed, Malawi has about 20 official languages, including Chichewa, which is the most widely spoken. Meanwhile, Uruguay is just one official language, Spanish, but with a unique dialect that's influenced by Italian and Portuguese. I think the sheer number of languages in Malawi creates a more complex language barrier.
That's fascinating. Leo, I agree. The language diversity in Malawi can be overwhelming, especially for foreigners. But I've heard that in Uruguay, the Spanish spoken is quite distinct, with a strong emphasis on pronunciation and rhythm. Have you had any personal experiences with the language in Uruguay?
Ah, yes. I once tried to order a coffee in a cafe in Montevideo, and the barista looked at me like I was speaking gibberish. I realized that my Spanish wasn't as fluent as I thought, and I had to rely on hand gestures to get what I wanted. But the people in Uruguay are so friendly and willing to help that I ended up having a great conversation with the barista.
I can imagine. I've heard that in Malawi, the Chichuan language is not only the most widely spoken but also the most complex. It has a rich system of prefixes and suffixes that can change the meaning of words entirely. Have you had any experiences with the language in Malawi?
Actually, Mira, I was lucky to have a friend who spoke Chichuan, and she helped me learn some basic phrases. But I remember being in a market in Lillingen trying to haggle with a vendor over the price of a basket. I ended up using a phrase that meant I'll give you 100 kwaches. But the vendor looked at me like I was crazy because I had actually offered him 50 kwaches.
Oh, Leo, that's hilarious. I can just imagine the look on the vendor's face. But seriously, language barriers can be a major challenge for expats and tourists in both countries. Have you heard about any language learning resources or programs that can help people navigate these challenges?
Ah, yes. In Uruguay, there are some excellent language schools and tutors who can help foreigners learn the local dialect. And in Malawi, there are organizations like the Malawi Language Association that promote language preservation and education. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you had experiences with language barriers in Malawi or Uruguay?
Well, Leo, I think our listeners are probably nodding their heads in agreement. But I want to add that language barriers can also be a great opportunity for cultural exchange and learning. When we encounter language difficulties, it can be a chance to connect with locals on a deeper level and learn about their customs and traditions.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think that's what makes travel so rewarding, the chance to navigate unfamiliar languages and cultures and come out with new experiences and insights. I'm certain that our listeners living in these countries would agree with me.
Well, Leo, I think we're on the same page. And speaking of cultural exchange, I've heard that in Uruguay, the tradition of asado, a communal barbecue, is a big part of the culture. Have you had any experiences with asado in Uruguay?
Ah, yes. I was lucky to attend an asado in Montevideo, and it was an incredible experience. The whole community came together to share food and stories, and it was a truly immersive experience. I think that's one of the things that makes Uruguay so special, the emphasis on community and social connection.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, I think we can all learn from the Uruguayan tradition of asado. And speaking of learning, I want to add that language learning apps like Duolingo can be a great resource for foreigners in both countries. Have you used any language learning apps in Malawi or Uruguay?
Ah, yes. I actually used Duolingo to learn some basic Chihuahua phrases in Malawi, and it was incredibly helpful. And in Uruguay, I used a language app called Uruguayan Spanish to improve my pronunciation and vocabulary.
Well, Leo, it sounds like you're a language learning pro. But seriously, language learning apps can be a great tool for navigating language barriers. And speaking of tools, I want to add that there are also many online resources and communities that can help foreigners in both countries.
Absolutely. Mira! And I think that's what makes the expat community so strong, the willingness to share knowledge and resources with one another. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about online resources and communities. Have any of you found any helpful resources for language learning or cultural exchange?
Well, Leo, I think our listeners are probably nodding their heads in agreement. And speaking of nodding heads, I want to add that in Malawi, the tradition of nodding is a big part of the culture. Have you had any experiences with nodding in Malawi? Leo?
Ah, yes. I was lucky to attend a traditional Malawian dance performance, and the nodding was a big part of the ceremony. I think it's a beautiful way to show respect and appreciation for the culture.
That sounds amazing. Leo, I think we can all learn from the Malawian tradition of nodding. And speaking of learning, I want to add that language is not just about communication, it's also about culture and identity. Have you had any experiences with language and identity in Malawi or Uruguay?
Yes. In Uruguay, I was struck by the strong emphasis on language and identity, particularly in the context of the country's Italian and Portuguese heritage. And in Malawi, I was impressed by the way that language is used to preserve traditional culture and customs.
Well, Leo, I think we're both on the same page. And speaking of being on the same page, I want to add that language barriers can be a challenge, but they can also be an opportunity for connection and learning. What do you think, Leo?
Absolutely. Mira. And I think that we can counter that. And I think that's what makes travel and cultural exchange so rewarding, the chance to navigate language barriers and come out with new experiences and insights.
Malawi is a country with a rich cultural heritage, boasting over 20 ethnic groups. You can see this diversity in the vibrant markets and traditional attire of its people. I'm curious to know, Leo, what do you think is the secret to Malawi's tolerance?
I think it's because they've learned to appreciate their differences. You see, in Malawi, everyone is encouraged to express their unique culture, whether it's through music, dance, or even language. I mean, have you ever heard of the Chue people's traditional instrument, the mabira?
Yes, I have. It's a beautiful instrument with a rich history. But what's fascinating is how the different ethnic groups in Malawi have come together to create a unique cultural identity. I'm certain that our listeners living in Malawi would agree with me that this blending of cultures is what makes the country so special.
Absolutely. And it's not just the music and dance that showcase this diversity. Malawi's cuisine is also a delicious reflection of its cultural melting pot. You have the Chue people's traditional dish, ensima, which is made from maize meal, and the Ngoni people's dish, mur, which is made from steamed green bananas. It's a true culinary experience.
You're making me hungry, Leah. But seriously, I think what's impressive about Malawi is how it's managed to balance its rich cultural heritage with modernity. You see, in cities like Lulanje and Blantyre, you'll find a mix of traditional markets and modern shopping centers. It's a unique blend of old and new.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Malawi's ability to adapt and evolve while still preserving its cultural identity is truly inspiring. And it's not just limited to the country itself. Malawi has also been a haven for refugees and asylum seekers, providing them with a safe and welcoming environment.
Yes. Malawi's commitment to providing a safe haven for those in need is truly commendable. And I think it's this sense of community and social responsibility that's at the heart of Malawi's cultural diversity and tolerance. But, Leo, I have to ask, what about Uruguay? What's the cultural landscape like in this beautiful country?
Uruguay is a treasure trove of cultural diversity. From the indigenous Guarani people to the European settlers who arrived in the 18th century, Uruguay has a rich history of cultural exchange. And it's not just limited to the past. Uruguay is still a country that celebrates its cultural differences, with festivals like the Fiesta del Imia in Montevideo.
Oh, I've heard of that festival. It's a celebration of wine and culture, right? And I'm curious to know, Leo, what's the relationship like between the indigenous people and the European settlers in Uruguay?
It's a complex one, to say the least. But what's fascinating is how the indigenous people have managed to maintain their cultural identity despite the influence of European settlers. You see, in Uruguay, the indigenous people have been able to preserve their traditional ways of life, such as their language and customs, while also adapting to the modern world.
That's amazing. And I think it's this ability to adapt and evolve while still preserving one's cultural identity that's at the heart of Uruguay's cultural diversity and tolerance. But, Leo, I have to ask, what about the social harmony initiatives in Uruguay? What's being done to promote cultural understanding and tolerance?
Uruguay has a number of social harmony initiatives in place, including the Ministry of Social Development's program to promote cultural diversity and inclusion. And it's not just limited to government initiatives. Civil society organizations, such as the Uruguayan Human Rights Association, are also working to promote cultural understanding and tolerance.
Ah, that's wonderful to hear. And I think it's this sense of social responsibility and commitment to promoting cultural understanding that's at the heart of Uruguay's cultural diversity and tolerance. But, Leo, I have to ask, what's the relationship like between the two countries? How do they work together to promote cultural understanding and tolerance?
The relationship between Malawi and Uruguay is a fascinating one. While they may be geographically far apart, they share a common commitment to promoting cultural diversity and tolerance. And it's not just limited to government relations. Civil society organizations, such as the Malawi-Uruguay Friendship Association, are also working together to promote cultural understanding and exchange.
That's wonderful to hear. And I think it's this sense of international cooperation and solidarity that's at the heart of Malawi and Uruguay's cultural diversity and tolerance. But, Leo, I have to ask, what's the takeaway message from this conversation? What can our listeners take away from this discussion on cultural diversity and tolerance in Malawi and Uruguay?
I think the takeaway message is that cultural diversity and tolerance are not just values, but a way of life. It's about embracing our differences and working together to promote social harmony and understanding. And it's not just limited to Malawi and Uruguay. We can all learn from their example and work towards creating a more inclusive and tolerant society.
That's a wonderful message. Leo, and I think it's something that we can all take away from this conversation. Thank you, Leo, for sharing your insights and expertise on cultural diversity and tolerance in Malawi and Uruguay.
Thank you, Mira, for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure discussing this important topic with you.
So let's talk about Malawi and Uruguay when it comes to educational opportunities and language schools. I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about how these two countries compare.
That's right. Mira, Malawi and Uruguay both have unique strengths when it comes to education. In Malawi, the government has implemented initiatives to improve literacy rates, especially among children. They've also invested in teacher training programs to enhance the quality of education.
Wow, that's impressive. And in Uruguay, I've heard that they have a very high literacy rate, especially among women. They also have a strong emphasis on vocational training, which is great for students who want to learn a trade.
Exactly. Uruguay's education system is known for its flexibility and adaptability. They also have a strong focus on social and emotional learning, which helps students develop important life skills.
I love that. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that social and emotional learning is just as important as academic achievement. Speaking of which, have you heard about the innovative teaching methods being used in Malawi?
Actually, I have. Malawi is using a combination of traditional and modern teaching methods, including technology-based learning. They're also incorporating local languages and cultural practices into the curriculum, which helps students connect with their heritage.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in hearing more about how language schools in Uruguay are adapting to the needs of international students.
Yes. Uruguay has a growing number of language schools that cater to international students. These schools offer a range of programs, from beginners courses to advanced certification.
Well, that's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would be curious to know more about the costs associated with studying in Malawi versus Uruguay.
Well, Mira, I think it's worth noting that Malawi has a relatively low cost of living, which makes it an attractive option for international students. However, Uruguay has a more developed economy, which means that living costs are higher.
That's a good point, Leo. But I'm sure our listeners would be interested in hearing more about the types of programs available in both countries.
Yes. Malawi has a range of programs, from undergraduate to graduate degrees. They also have a strong focus on research and innovation, which is great for students who want to pursue advanced degrees.
I love that. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing more about the student life in Uruguay.
Well, Nira, I think it's worth noting that Uruguay has a vibrant student culture. with many universities and language schools offering extracurricular activities and events.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would be curious to know more about the job prospects for international students in both countries.
Yes. Malawi has a growing economy, with many job opportunities in industries such as agriculture and manufacturing. Uruguay also has a strong economy, with many job opportunities in industries such as tourism and finance.
Wow, that's great to know. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in hearing more about the cultural experiences that students can have in both countries.
Yes. Malawi has a rich cultural heritage, with many traditional festivals and celebrations throughout the year. Uruguay also has a vibrant cultural scene, with many festivals and events celebrating music, dance, and art.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners would be curious to know more about the language requirements for international students in both countries.
Yes. Malawi requires students to have a good command of English, while Uruguay requires students to have a good command of Spanish.
That's great to know. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in hearing more about the support services available for international students in both countries.
Yes. Both Malawi and Uruguay have a range of support services available for international students, including academic advising, counseling, and housing assistance.
Well, that's great to know. And I'm sure our listeners would be curious to know more about the scholarships and financial aid available for international students in both countries.
Yes. Both Malawi and Uruguay offer a range of scholarships and financial aid options for international students, including government-funded scholarships and private scholarships.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing more about the student testimonials from both countries.
Yes. I've spoken to many students who have studied in Malawi and Uruguay, and they all have wonderful stories to share about their experiences.
I'd love to hear more about that. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing more about the unique educational opportunities available in both countries.
Yes. Malawi has a range of unique educational opportunities, including a program for students to learn traditional African languages and cultures.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing more about the innovative teaching methods being used in Uruguay.
Yes. Uruguay is using a range of innovative teaching methods, including project-based learning on flipped classrooms.
I love that. And I'm sure our listeners would be curious to know more about the types of programs available for students with disabilities in both countries.
Yes. Both Malawi and Uruguay have programs in place to support students with disabilities, including accommodations and assistive technologies.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing more about the job market for graduates in both countries.
Yes. Malawi has a growing job market, with many opportunities in industries such as agriculture and manufacturing. Uruguay also has a strong job market, with many opportunities in industries such as tourism and finance.
Wow, that's great to know. And I'm sure our listeners would be curious to know more about the cultural experiences that students can have in both countries.
Yes. Malawi has a rich cultural heritage, with many traditional festivals and celebrations throughout the year. Uruguay also has a vibrant cultural scene, with many festivals and events celebrating music, dance, and art.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in hearing more about the language requirements for international students in both countries.
Yes. Malawi requires students to have a good command of English, while Uruguay requires students to have a good command of Spanish.
That's great to know. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing more about the support services available for international students in both countries.
Yes. Both Malawi and Uruguay have a range of support services available for international students, including academic advising, counseling, and housing assistance.
Well, that's great to know. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in hearing more about the scholarships and financial aid available for international students in both countries.
Yes. Both Malawi and Uruguay offer a range of scholarships and financial aid options for international students.
You know, Leo, I'm fascinated by the unique climates of Malawi and Uruguay. Let's start by talking about temperature. Malawi has a tropical climate, with temperatures ranging from 15 degrees Celsius to 25 degrees Celsius throughout the year. That's quite a contrast to Uruguay, which has a temperate climate with temperatures between 10 degrees Celsius and 20 degrees Celsius.
Ah, yes. And did you know that Malawi's temperature varies depending on the region? The highlands have a cooler climate, while the lowlands are hotter. It's like having the different worlds in one country.
That's a great way to put it. Leo! And I'm sure our listeners living in Malawi would agree with me that the temperature is just one of the many factors that make the country's climate so unique. But let's talk about Uruguay for a moment. I'm curious. Have you ever been to Uruguay?
Actually, I haven't. But I've heard great things about the country's climate. From what I've learned, Uruguay has a humid subtropical climate, which means it experiences hot summers and mild winters. That's quite different from Malawi's tropical climate, don't you think?
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Uruguay's climate so fascinating. The country's geography, with its many rivers and lakes, helps regulate the temperature and create a more stable climate. But I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about Malawi's climate. What do you think is the most interesting aspect of Malawi's climate? Leo?
That's a tough question. But I think one of the most interesting aspects of Malawi's climate is the fact that it experiences a rainy season, known as the wet season. During this time, the country receives most of its annual rainfall, which is essential for agriculture and other economic activities.
Yes. The rainy season is definitely an important aspect of Malawi's climate. And I think it's interesting to note that the country's climate is also influenced by its location near the equator. The tropical sun beats down on the country, creating a warm and humid climate. But our listeners would love to hear more about Uruguay's climate as well.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of Uruguay's climate is the fact that it experiences a wide range of temperatures throughout the year, from the hot summers to the mild winters. Uruguay's climate is definitely unique. And did you know that the country's climate is also influenced by its location near the Atlantic Ocean? The ocean helps regulate the temperature and create a more stable climate.
Yes, that's a great point. Leo. And I think it's interesting to note that both Malawi and Uruguay have a rich cultural heritage when it comes to their climates. In Malawi, the climate is often associated with the country's agricultural sector, while in Uruguay, the climate is often linked to the country's rural traditions.
Yes. And I think that's what makes the climate of these two countries so fascinating. The climate is not just a physical aspect of the country, but also a cultural and economic one. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the ways in which the climate affects daily life in Malawi and Uruguay.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of the climate in these two countries is the way in which it affects the local wildlife. In Malawi, the climate creates a habitat for a wide range of animals, from elephants to lions. And in Uruguay, the climate supports a diverse range of wildlife, from birds to reptiles.
Yes. I think that's what makes the climate of these two countries so unique. The climate is not just a physical aspect of the country, but also a biological one. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the ways in which the climate affects the local ecosystems in Malawi and Uruguay.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today's topic. But before we go, I just want to ask our listeners a question. If you're living in Malawi or Uruguay, what do you think is the most interesting aspect of the climate in your country? Do you have any favorite activities or traditions that are influenced by the climate? Let us know in the comments.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more content on climate and seasonal conditions in Malawi and Uruguay. We'll be back with more topics soon, so stay tuned.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Until next time, when we'll be discussing another fascinating topic. Take care. When it comes to food culture, Malawi and Uruguay are two countries that have a lot to offer. From traditional dishes to modern twists, let's dive into the culinary heritage of these two countries. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried Malawian food before?
Yes, I have. In fact, I had a wonderful experience trying an SMA, which is a staple food in Malawi. It's a thick cornmeal porridge that's often served with stews or relishes. The best part is, it's incredibly filling and delicious.
That sounds amazing. I've also heard that Malawian cuisine is heavily influenced by African, British, and Asian flavors. Have you noticed any similarities or differences between Malawian and Uruguayan food?
That's a great question. Well, both countries have their own unique flavors. I think what's interesting is that Malawian food tends to be more hearty and comforting, whereas Uruguayan cuisine is often more refined and delicate. Of course, this is just my observation, but I think it's fascinating to see how different cultures can shape the way we eat.
I completely agree. And speaking of Uruguay, have you ever tried a traditional Uruguayan asado? I've heard it's a must-try when visiting the country.
Ah, yes. An asado is a fantastic experience, and it's all about the slow-cooked meats, like beef, pork, and chorizo. The way the flavors meld together is just incredible. And did you know that Uruguay is famous for its grass-fed beef? It's some of the best in the world.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's better to opt for grass-fed beef or conventionally raised beef?
Well, I think it's a no-brainer, don't you? Grass-fed beef is not only better for the environment, but it's also more nutritious and delicious. But I'm sure some of our listeners might have different opinions.
Exactly. And speaking of nutrition, let's talk about some of the health benefits of Malawian and Uruguayan cuisine. I heard that both countries have a strong emphasis on local sourced ingredients and traditional cooking methods.
That's absolutely right. In Malawi, for example, many households still use traditional cooking methods like wood-fired stoves or charcoal grills. And in Uruguay, you'll often find restaurants serving fresh seafood and locally raised meats. It's amazing to see how these countries prioritize the health and sustainability of their food systems.
I completely agree. And I think it's wonderful to see how food culture can bring people together. Have you ever had the chance to try any traditional Malawian dishes with locals?
Ah, yes. In fact, I had the pleasure of trying an SMA with a Malawian family during a homestay experience. It was an incredible experience, and I learned so much about the culture and traditions of the country.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experience. And speaking of cultural exchange, I've heard that Uruguay has a strong tradition of cultural festivals and events.
Ah, yes. Uruguay is known for its vibrant cultural scene, and festivals like the Fiestas de la Vida and Demia in Montevideo are a must-see. The way the locals come together to celebrate their heritage is just incredible.
I completely agree. And I think it's wonderful to see how food culture can be a part of these celebrations. Have you ever tried any traditional Uruguayan desserts? Like alfajor rays or tortas as?
Ah, yes. Alfajor rays are a favorite of mine. And I just love the combination of the sweet cookie and the creamy dulce de leche filling. It's the perfect treat after a long day of exploring.
That sounds delicious. And I think it's time for us to wrap up this segment on food culture and nutritional alternatives in Malawi and Uruguay. But before we go, I'm curious. Leo, do you have any final thoughts on the topic?
Well, I think what's most interesting is how both countries have managed to balance tradition with modernity in their food cultures. From traditional dishes to innovative twists, there's always something new to discover in Malawi and Uruguay.
I completely agree. And I think our listeners will agree that food culture is a vital part of any country's identity. Thanks for joining us on this culinary journey. And we hope you'll tune next time for more fascinating conversations about food, culture, and travel.
And don't forget to try the local cuisine when you visit Malawi and Uruguay. It's a culinary experience you'll never forget.
I'm fascinated by the ancient history of Malawi. Leo, did you know that the country has a rich cultural heritage dating back to the 10th century?
Ah, yes. Mira, Malawi's history is indeed fascinating. I've always been intrigued by the stories of the Chue people, who are one of the largest ethnic groups in the country.
Exactly. And their traditional dances and music are still an integral part of Malawian culture today. I've seen videos of the Chue people performing these dances, and it's like they're telling stories through movement.
That's so true. Mira, and speaking of storytelling, have you heard about the epic poem of the Chue people, which is passed down through generations?
Yes, I have. It's called the Chue Epic, and it's a legendary poem that tells the story of the Chue people's migration to Malawi. It's like a national treasure, really.
Exactly. And it's not just the Chue people who have a rich cultural heritage. Malawi as a whole has a diverse cultural landscape, with over 50 ethnic groups, each with their own unique traditions and customs.
That's amazing. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these different ethnic groups. I'm certain that our listeners living in Malawi would agree with me that the country's cultural diversity is one of its greatest strengths.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of strength, Malawi's natural beauty is also a significant part of its cultural heritage. From the stunning Lake Malawi to the majestic Nyka National Park, the country's natural wonders are a treasure trove of artistic inspiration.
Oh, I completely agree. And I think that's one of the reasons why Malawi is such a popular destination for artists and creatives. The country's unique landscapes and cultural heritage provide endless inspiration for art, music, and literature.
That's so true. Mira, and I think it's also worth mentioning that Malawi has a thriving art scene, with many talented artists and musicians who are making waves both locally and internationally.
That's fantastic. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about these talented artists and musicians. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about Malawi's art scene. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
Great point. Mira. And speaking of comments, I think it's worth mentioning that Malawi's cultural heritage is not just limited to its traditional dances and music. The country also has a rich history of storytelling through oral traditions, such as the Kuwaiwa storytelling tradition.
Yes, I've heard of that. The Kuwaiwa tradition is a fascinating example of Malawi's rich cultural heritage. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Uruguay, our second country of comparison, also has a rich cultural heritage, particularly in the field of art and literature.
Yes. Mira, Uruguay's cultural heritage is indeed fascinating, particularly in the field of art. From the works of the Uruguayan artist Joaquin Torres Garcia to the literature of Juan Melendez Valdez, Uruguay has a rich cultural landscape that is worth exploring.
That's so true. Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Uruguay has a thriving art scene, with many talented artists and musicians who are making waves both locally and internationally.
Absolutely. Yeah. And speaking of international recognition, I think it's worth mentioning that Uruguay's cultural heritage has been recognized by UNESCO, with several of its cultural sites and traditions being designated as intangible cultural heritage of humanity.
Oh, yes. That's amazing. Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Malawi's cultural heritage has been recognized by UNESCO, with several of its cultural sites and traditions being designated as intangible cultural heritage of humanity as well.
Yes, Mira. And speaking of recognition, I think it's worth mentioning that Malawi's cultural heritage is not just limited to its traditional dances and music. The country also has a rich history of storytelling through oral traditions, such as the Kuwaiwa storytelling tradition.
Yes. I've heard of that. The Kuwaiwa tradition is a fascinating example of Malawi's rich cultural heritage. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Uruguay's cultural heritage is not just limited to its art and literature. The country also has a rich history of music and dance, particularly in the field of tango.
Yes. Mira, and speaking of tango, I think it's worth mentioning that Uruguay has a unique take on this traditional dance form, with its own distinct style and flair.
Yes. I've seen videos of Uruguayan tango dancers, and it's like they're telling stories through movement. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Malawi has its own unique take on traditional dances, such as the Chue dance.
Yes. Mia, and speaking of dance, I think it's worth mentioning that both Malawi and Uruguay have a rich cultural heritage of traditional dances that are still performed today.
Uh, yes, that's true, Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a thriving art scene, with many talented artists and musicians who are making waves both locally and internationally.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of international recognition, I think it's worth mentioning that both Malawi and Uruguay have been recognized by UNESCO for their cultural heritage.
Ah, yes, that's amazing, Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a rich cultural landscape that is worth exploring, particularly in the fields of art and literature.
Ah, yes. Mira, and speaking of literature, I think it's worth mentioning that Uruguay has a rich literary heritage, particularly in the works of the Uruguayan writer Juan Melendez Valdez.
Ah, yes. I've heard of him. Juan Melendez Valdez is a fascinating writer who has made significant contributions to Uruguayan literature.
Ah, yes. Mira, and speaking of contributions, I think it's worth mentioning that Malawi has also made significant contributions to literature, particularly in the works of the Malawian writer Steve Kaimambo.
Ah, yes. I've heard of him. Steve Kaimambo is a talented writer who has made significant contributions to Malawian literature.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of contributions, I think it's worth mentioning that both Malawi and Uruguay have a rich cultural heritage that is worth exploring, particularly in the field of art and literature.
Ah, yes. That's true. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a thriving art scene, with many talented artists and musicians who are making waves both locally and internationally.
Ah, yes.
You know, Leah, have you ever noticed how different countries have their own unique landscapes that just take your breath away? And today, we're comparing to countries that are definitely not in the same league when it comes to natural beauty, Malawi and Uruguay.
Ah, yes. Malawi and Uruguay. Two countries that are actually quite far apart from each other. But, I have to say, I had to dive into their natural wonders. Malawi, for instance, is known for its stunning Lake Malawi, which is often referred to as the Calendar Lake because of its crystal clear waters.
That's right. Leo, and speaking of crystal clear waters, Uruguay has its own stunning coastline along the Atlantic Ocean. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think our listeners living in Uruguay would agree that their coastline is just as beautiful as Lake Malawi?
Well, I think both countries have their own unique charm. But, let's talk about Malawi's landscape a bit more. Did you know that Malawi is home to some of the highest peaks in Africa? Including Mount Mulanje, which is over 3,000 meters tall?
Wow, that's impressive. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the hiking opportunities in Malawi. But before we dive into that, I want to say that Uruguay's coastline is not just about the beach. The country has a lot of unique landscapes, including the Rio de la Plata, which is a major river that flows into the Atlantic Ocean.
Ah, yes. The Rio de la Plata. That's a great point. Yeah. And speaking of rivers, Malawi has its own share of stunning rivers, including the Shire River, which flows through the heart of the country. But, I have to say, I'm a bit biased towards Malawi's natural beauty. I mean, have you seen the pictures of the Nyala National Park?
Oh, Leo, you're such a fan of Malawi's national parks. But I have to agree, they're definitely breathtaking. And speaking of breathtaking, Uruguay's coastline is not just about the beach. It's also about the scenic drives along the coast. Have you ever taken a drive along the Route 1 in Uruguay? Leo?
Ah, yes, I have. And it's definitely a stunning drive. But, I have to say, I think Malawi's national parks are a bit more unique. I mean, have you seen the pictures of the Lee 1 National Park?
Oh, Leo, you're such a park enthusiast. But, seriously, both countries have their own unique national parks. And speaking of unique, Uruguay's coastline has its own unique feature, the Punta del Este. which is a popular tourist destination known for its stunning beaches and scenic views.
Ah, yes. Punta del Este. That's a great point. Mira, and speaking of beaches, Malawi has its own share of stunning beaches, including the Nkayade Bay, which is a popular spot for water sports.
Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the water sports opportunities in Malawi. But before we dive into that, I want to say that Uruguay's coastline is not just about the beach. The country has a lot of unique landscapes, including the Cerro de los Animas, which is a stunning hill that offers breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape.
Ah, yes. The Cerro de los Animas. That's a great point. Mira, and speaking of breathtaking views, Malawi has its own share of stunning vistas, including the view from the top of Mount Mulanje.
Wow, that sounds like an amazing experience. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the hiking opportunities in Malawi. But before we dive into that, I want to say that Uruguay's coastline is not just about the beach. The country has a lot of unique landscapes, including the Rio Negro, which is a major river that flows into the Atlantic Ocean.
Ah, yes. The Rio Negro. That's a great point. Mira, and speaking of rivers, Malawi has its own share of stunning rivers, including the Zambezi River, which flows through the heart of the country.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of fun. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the water sports opportunities in Malawi. But before we dive into that, I want to say that Uruguay's coastline is not just about the beach. The country has a lot of unique landscapes, including the Cabo Olio, which is a stunning headland that offers breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape.
Ah, yes. The Cabo Polo in Io. That's a great point. Mira, and speaking of breathtaking views, Malawi has its own share of stunning vistas, including the view from the top of the Niola National Park.
Well, that sounds like an amazing experience. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the hiking opportunities in Malawi. But before we dive into that, I want to say that Uruguay's coastline is not just about the beach. The country has a lot of unique landscapes, including the Rio del Oblota, which is a major river that flows into the Atlantic Ocean.
Ah, yes. The Rio de la Plata. That's a great point. Mira, and speaking of rivers, Malawi has its own share of stunning rivers, including the Shire River, which flows through the heart of the country.
Well, it looks like we've reached the end of our topic on natural beauties and landscapes in Malawi and Uruguay. But before we wrap up, I want to ask our listeners, what do you think are the most beautiful landscapes in these two countries? Do you think Malawi's national parks are more unique than Uruguay's coastline? Let us know in the comments.
Ah, great point. Mira, and speaking of comments, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this topic. But before we wrap up, I want to say that both countries have their own unique natural beauty that's definitely worth exploring. Whether it's the stunning coastline of Uruguay or the breathtaking national parks of Malawi, there's something for everyone in these two countries.
Well, let's stop here. But before we say goodbye, I want to say that we'll be back with more exciting topics and comparisons. Stay tuned. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more fun and informative content. Malawi, a country that's not only blessed with stunning natural beauty, but also has a rich sporting culture. Leo, what are your thoughts on the country's love for sports?
Ah, yes. Malawi's passion for sports is contagious. I mean, have you seen their enthusiasm for football? They call it the beautiful game, but I think it's more like the beautiful chaos out there.
Oh, Leo, you're such a jokester. But seriously, football is a huge part of Malawi's culture. And did you know that the country has produced some talented athletes, including Olympic medalists?
That's right, Mira. And speaking of talented athletes, let's talk about Uruguay's football team. They have a rich history of producing some of the best players in the world, like Luis Suarez and Diego Forlan. I mean, Have you seen their skills on the pitch?
Oh, yes. The Irrigation know how to play football. But, Leo, let's not forget about Malawi's other sports, like netball and basketball. The country has a strong following for these sports, and it's not uncommon to see them played in local communities.
That's true, Mira. And I think it's great that Malawi has a strong focus on grassroots sports development. It's essential for creating a healthy and active lifestyle for its citizens. And speaking of healthy lifestyles, have you tried the Uruguayan diet? It's all about me, and more me.
Oh, Leo, you're such a tease. But the Uruguayan diet does feature a lot of meat. But it's also known for its delicious seafood and fresh produce. And, of course, who can forget about Malawi's famous fish markets?
Ah, yes. The fish markets in Malawi are a treat. And did you know that Uruguay has a similar love for seafood? In fact, the country's coastline offers some of the best seafood in the region.
That's right. And, as we know, both countries have a strong focus on outdoor activities. Malawi's famous for its hiking and trekking trails, while Uruguay has some amazing surfing spots.
That's true, Mira. And I think it's great that both countries offer such a wide range of outdoor activities for tourists and locals alike. Whether you're a thrill seeker or just looking for a relaxing getaway, there's something for everyone in Malawi and Uruguay.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Malawi would agree with me when I say that the country's natural beauty is a major draw for tourists. And, Leo, I'm curious to know what our listeners think about the sports and outdoor activities in Uruguay. Do you think they're up to the challenge?
I think our listeners are a tough crowd, Mira. But, seriously, I'm sure they'll love the unique blend of culture and adventure that Uruguay has to offer. And, who knows, maybe one day we'll have a podcast episode all about Uruguay's surfing spots.
Oh, Leo, you're such a jokester. But, seriously, I think that's a great idea for a future podcast episode. And, who knows, maybe we'll even get some tips from our listeners on how to navigate the surfing spots in Uruguay.
I'd love to hear from our listeners. Mira, and as we wrap up this topic, I want to say that both Malawi and Uruguay offer a unique and exciting experience for sports and outdoor enthusiasts. Whether you're looking for a relaxing getaway or an adrenaline-packed adventure, there's something for everyone in these two countries.
And, Leo, I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on community and social responsibility. In Malawi, you'll find many local communities coming together to support sports and outdoor activities, while in Uruguay, you'll see a strong emphasis on social responsibility and community development.
That's right, Mira. And as we continue to explore the sports and outdoor activities in Malawi and Uruguay, I think it's essential that we highlight the importance of community and social responsibility. After all, it's not just about having fun and enjoying the great outdoors, but also about giving back to the communities that make these experiences possible.
I completely agree with you, Leo. And as we move on to the next topic, I want to say that I'm to hear from our listeners about their experiences with sports and outdoor activities in Malawi and Uruguay. Do you have any tips or recommendations for our listeners? Leo?
I do. Mira, and I think it's essential that our listeners try to immerse themselves in the local culture and community. Whether it's attending a local sports event or participating in a community-led outdoor activity, I think it's a great way to experience the true spirit of Malawi and Uruguay.
That's a great point, Leo. And as we wrap up this podcast episode, I want to say that I hope our listeners have enjoyed learning about the sports and outdoor activities in Malawi and Uruguay. And, Leo, I'm curious to know what our listeners think about the importance of community and social responsibility in these two countries.
I think our listeners will agree with me when I say that community and social responsibility are essential components of any sports and outdoor activity. And as we continue to explore the unique experiences that Malawi and Uruguay have to offer, I think it's essential that we highlight the importance of giving back to the communities that make these experiences possible.
So, let's talk about nightlife in Malawi. I'm sure our listeners living in Malawi would agree that the best way to experience it is by attending a traditional village party. These events are usually held on weekends and feature local music, dancing, and delicious food.
Ah, yes. I've heard about these village parties. They sound like a real blast. But have you ever tried to navigate the roads in Malawi at night? It's like a whole different world out there. The roads are dark, and the drivers are, let's just say, creative.
That's true, Leah. But, trust me, it's worth the risk. The village parties are an experience like no other. And, who knows, you might even learn a few traditional dances.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll be a natural. But, seriously, Mira, have you ever tried to find a decent club or bar in Malawi? It's like searching for a needle in a haystack.
Okay, I get it. Malawi's nightlife might not be the most exciting, but it's still got its charm. And, hey, if you're looking for a more low-key experience, you could always try a local pub or restaurant.
Yeah, because nothing says nightlife like a pub full of locals watching football. But, in all seriousness, Mira, what about Uruguay? I've heard their nightlife is something else.
Oh, yes. Uruguay's nightlife is incredible. From the vibrant streets of Montevideo to the beach towns of Punta del Este, there's always something going on. And, let me tell you, the people in Uruguay know how to party.
I bet they do. But, have you ever been to a penna in Uruguay? Those things are legendary. They're like giant parties that go on all night.
Yes, I have been to a penna in Uruguay, and it was an experience I'll never forget. The music, the dancing, the food, it was all just so much fun.
I'm sure it was. And, hey, if you're feeling adventurous, you could always try your hand at a little samba dancing.
Oh, Leo, you know I'd love to. But, seriously, have you ever noticed how much Uruguay's nightlife scene has evolved in recent years? It's like a whole new country.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. And it's not just the nightlife scene that's changed. The whole country has become more modern and cosmopolitan.
That's right. And I think that's one of the reasons why Uruguay's nightlife is so great. It's got a little bit of everything.
Yeah, and a little bit of nothing, too. But, in all seriousness, Mira, what about the music scene in Malawi? I've heard it's really thriving.
Yes. The music scene in Malawi is amazing. From traditional music to modern genres like hip-hop and R&B, there's something for everyone.
That's great to hear. And, hey, if you're looking for a unique music experience, you could always try attending a traditional music festival in Malawi.
Oh, that sounds like a blast. And, hey, if you're feeling brave, you could always try your hand at traditional Malawian dance.
Yeah, because nothing says nightlife like a traditional dance performance.
Okay, I get it. But, seriously, Leo, what about the safety of nightlife in Uruguay? I've heard it's a bit of a concern.
Ah, yes. Safety is always a concern in any country, especially at night. But I've heard that Uruguay has a relatively low crime rate compared to other countries in the region.
That's good to know. And, hey, if you're looking for a safe and fun nightlife experience in Uruguay, you could always try visiting the trendy neighborhood of Pocos.
Yeah, because nothing says safety like a trendy neighborhood.
Okay, I get it. But, seriously, Leah, what about the best time to visit Malawi for nightlife? I've heard it's during the dry season.
Yes. The dry season is definitely the best time to visit Malawi for nightlife. The weather is cooler, and the crowds are smaller.
Oh, that's great to know. And, hey, if you're looking for a unique nightlife experience in Malawi, You could always try attending a traditional village party during the dry season.
Yeah, because nothing says nightlife like a traditional village party.
Okay, okay, I get it. But, seriously, Leo, what about the best nightlife spots in Uruguay? I've heard they're all over the country.
Ah, yes. Uruguay's got a nightlife scene that's spread out all over the country. From the beach towns of Punta del Este to the capital city of Montevideo. There's always something going on.
Oh, that sounds like a blast. And, hey, if you're looking for a unique nightlife experience in Uruguay, you could always try visiting the historic neighborhood of Old Town.
Yeah, because nothing says nightlife like a historic neighborhood.
Okay, I get it. But, Leo, what about the best time to visit Uruguay for nightlife? I've heard it's during the summer months.
Ah, yes. The summer months are definitely the best time to visit Uruguay for nightlife. The weather is warm, and the crowds are bigger.
Oh, that's great to know. And, hey, if you're looking for a unique nightlife experience in Uruguay, you could always try attending a penna during the summer months.
Yeah, because nothing says nightlife like a penna.
Okay, I get it. But, Leo, what about the safety of nightlife in Malawi? I've heard it's a bit of a concern.
Ah, yes. Safety is always a concern in any country, especially at night. But I've heard that Malawi has a relatively low crime rate compared to other countries in.
Malawi and Uruguay. Two countries that are perfect for families, with a strong focus on family-friendly environments and children's activities. I'm certain that our listeners living in these countries would agree with me.
Absolutely. Mira, Malawi's natural beauty, with its lakes, mountains, and forests, makes it an ideal destination for outdoor activities with kids. And Uruguay, with its charming cities and beautiful coastline, offers a more relaxed atmosphere for family vacations.
That's right. Leo, and let's not forget about the cultural aspects of both countries. In Malawi, the Chile people have a rich tradition of storytelling and music, which is perfect for kids to learn about and appreciate. And in Uruguay, the gaucho culture is a great way to introduce children to the country's history and customs.
I love how both countries prioritize family time. In Malawi, the concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, is all about community and family, which is reflected in the way families come together to support each other. And in Uruguay, the concept of Parrando family gathering is a big part of the culture, where families get together to share meals and stories.
Exactly. And it's not just about the cultural aspects, but also about the infrastructure that supports families. In Malawi, there are many family-friendly resorts and hotels that cater to families with children. While in Uruguay, the city of Montevideo has a beautiful park system that's perfect for kids to run around and play.
Ah, yes. And let's not forget about the food. In Malawi, the traditional dish of enzima cornmeal porridge is a staple for families. While in Uruguay, the asado, a traditional barbecue, is a great way for families to come together and share a meal.
Food is always a great way to bring families together. And speaking of food, I'm curious about what our listeners think about the traditional Malawian dish of kop enta, a type of fried fish. Have any of our listeners tried it before?
Well, I think we might have some Malawian listeners who can chime in on that one. But in all seriousness, both Malawi and Uruguay offer a unique experience for families. And it's great to see how both countries prioritize family time and activities.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a strong focus on education, which is essential for children's development. In Malawi, the government has implemented programs to improve education, while in Uruguay, the education system is highly regarded and provides excellent opportunities for students.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community, which is reflected in the way families and communities come together to support each other, whether it's through traditional music and dance or through community-based initiatives. Both countries have a lot to offer in terms of family-friendly activities and community engagement.
Well said, Leo. And I think we should also mention the beautiful beaches in both countries. In Malawi, the shores of Lake Malawi are perfect for swimming and snorkeling, while in Uruguay, the coastline offers stunning beaches and scenic views.
Ah, yes. And let's not forget about the wildlife. In Malawi, the national parks offer a chance to see incredible wildlife, including elephants, lions, and giraffes. While in Uruguay, the estancia's traditional ranches offer a chance to see gauchos and their horses.
Wow, it sounds like both countries have a lot to offer in terms of family-friendly activities and wildlife. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to either of these countries with your family?
Well, I think we might have some listeners who can share their experiences with us. But in all seriousness, both Malawi and Uruguay are great destinations for families. And it's worth considering both countries for your next family vacation.
Absolutely. And I think we should also mention the language, which is a great way to introduce children to the culture of both countries. In Malawi, the official language is Chihuahua, while in Uruguay, the official language is Spanish, but many people also speak Portuguese and Italian.
Ah, yes. And let's not forget about the festivals and celebrations. In Malawi, the Chue people celebrate the Mia traditional festival, while in Uruguay, the Fiesta de la Vie and Dimia, a wine harvest festival, is a great way to experience the culture and traditions of the country.
Well, it sounds like both countries have a lot to offer in terms of family-friendly activities and cultural experiences. I'm curious, have any of our listeners ever attended a traditional festival or celebration in either country?
Well, I think we might have some listeners who can share their experiences with us. But in all seriousness, both Malawi and Uruguay offer a unique experience for families. And it's worth considering both countries for your next family vacation.
Absolutely. And finally, I think we should mention the cost of living, which is an important factor for families when planning a trip. In Malawi, the cost of living is relatively low, while in Uruguay, the cost of living is higher, but still relatively affordable compared to other countries in South America.
Ah, yes. And let's not forget about the infrastructure, which is also an important factor for families. In Malawi, the roads can be rough, while in Uruguay, the roads are generally good, making it easier to get around.
Well, it sounds like both countries have their pros and cons, but ultimately, both countries are great destinations for families. And I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the most important factor for families when planning a trip to either country?
That's a tough question, but I think it's all about finding the right balance between adventure, culture, and family-friendly activities. And I think both Malawi and Uruguay offer that balance perfectly.
Absolutely. And I think we should wrap up by saying that both countries are wonderful destinations for families. And it's worth considering both countries for your next family vacation.
Agreed. And I think we should also mention that both countries have a lot to offer in terms of family-friendly activities and cultural experiences. Whether it's through traditional music and dance or through community-based initiatives, both countries have a lot to offer.
Well, that's all for this criterion. Thanks for listening, everyone. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on family-friendly destinations around the world. I'm curious about Malawi's LGBT scene. It seems like a beautiful country, but I've heard mixed reviews about its inclusivity.
Ah, yes. Malawi has been working to improve its LGBT rights, but it's still a bit of a mixed bag. In 2017, the government actually changed its stance on homosexuality, decriminalizing it. But there's still a way to go.
Well, that's a big step forward. I'm sure our listeners living in Malawi would agree with me that it's essential to have a safe and welcoming environment for everyone.
Absolutely. And it's great to see the country making progress. But, I have to say, I've heard that Blanchard, the largest city, has a pretty vibrant LGBT community, with some amazing bars and clubs.
Ooh, that sounds like fun. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you been to Blantyre and experienced the LGBT scene there?
Well, I'm not sure if our listeners have, but I've heard that the community in Blantyre is quite lively. And, in fact, there's even a gay pride event held every year, which is a great sign of progress.
That's fantastic. I'm sure it's a wonderful experience for those who attend. Now, let's talk about Uruguay. I've heard it's a pretty LGBT-friendly country, but I'd love to hear more about it.
Ah, yes. Uruguay is definitely one of the most LGBT-friendly countries in the world. In fact, it's been recognized as one of the most gay-friendly countries by various organizations.
That's amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about what makes Uruguay so welcoming to the LGBT community.
Well, for one, Uruguay has a very progressive government that has actively worked to promote LGBT rights. And in 2009, it even became the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that it's essential to have equal rights for all, regardless of their sexual orientation.
And, of course, Uruguay's LGBT community is quite vibrant, with many bars, clubs, and festivals celebrating diversity and inclusivity.
Ooh, that sounds like a blast. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about Uruguay's LGBT scene. Have any of you visited Uruguay and experienced its LGBT culture?
Well, I'm not sure if our listeners have, but I've heard that the community in Montevideo, the capital city, is particularly lively, with many gay bars and clubs.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about what makes Uruguay so LGBT friendly. Maybe we can even get some tips from our listeners who have visited the country.
Absolutely. And who knows? Maybe one day we'll even get to visit Uruguay and experience its LGBT scene firsthand.
That would be amazing. And in the meantime, let's keep exploring and learning more about these two countries and their LGBT communities.
Agree. And, as always, we want to hear from our listeners. If you have any thoughts or experiences to share, please let us know in the comments below.
I'm curious. Have you ever had a warm welcome in Malawi? Leo? I've heard the locals are some of the friendliest people on earth.
Ah, yes. I once stayed in a small village in Malawi and the host family took me in like one of their own. They fed me traditional food, showed me around the village, and even taught me some of the local language. It was an incredible experience.
That sounds amazing. I've heard the same stories about Malawi's warm hospitality. And what about Uruguay? Leo, have you ever visited there?
Actually, I have. And I was struck by how welcoming the people were, especially in the smaller towns. They'd invite me to join them for asado, which is a traditional Uruguayan barbecue, and share stories about their families and traditions.
Asado sounds delicious. And I've heard that Uruguay has a strong tradition of welcoming foreigners, especially in the coastal towns. I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me.
Absolutely. Uruguay has a reputation for being one of the most open and tolerant countries in South America. And I think that's reflected in the way the locals treat foreigners.
That's great to hear. So, let's talk more about the differences between Malawi and Uruguay when it comes to hospitality. I've heard that Malawi has a more formal approach to welcoming foreigners, especially in the cities.
Ah, yes. In Malawi, you'll often be greeted with a formal jambo or moi, which is a sign of respect. But in Uruguay, it's more relaxed and informal. You'll often be greeted with a friendly hola, como estes, or buenos dias.
I see what you mean. And what about the local customs? I've heard that Malawi has a strong tradition of respecting elders and traditional leaders.
Yes, that's true. In Malawi, you'll often see people showing respect to elders by bowing or using formal language. But in Uruguay, it's more egalitarian and democratic. Everyone is equal, and you'll often see people of all ages and backgrounds interacting and participating in community events.
That's fascinating. And I'm curious. Have you ever experienced any cultural differences between Malawi and Uruguay that made you feel uncomfortable?
Well, actually, I once tried to join in a traditional dance in Malawi, and I ended up tripping over my own feet. The locals were very kind and laughed along with me, but I realized that I needed to be more respectful of the local customs and traditions.
Oh, that's hilarious. I'm sure our listeners can relate to that experience. And what about the language barrier? I've heard that Malawi has many languages spoken, including Chichewa and Chit-Umbuka.
Ah, yes. In Malawi, you'll often hear many languages being spoken, and it can be challenging for foreigners to communicate. But in Uruguay, the official language is Spanish, and many people speak English as a second language.
That's great to hear. And what about the role of technology in facilitating hospitality and communication between foreigners and locals? I've heard that both Malawi and Uruguay have made significant investments in digital infrastructure.
Ah, yes. In both countries, you'll find many digital platforms and apps that facilitate communication and connection between foreigners and locals. For example, in Malawi, there are many online communities and forums where foreigners can connect with locals and ask for advice or recommendations.
That's fantastic. And I'm curious, have you ever used any of these digital platforms to connect with locals in either country?
Actually, I have. I used a social media platform to connect with a local guide in Malawi, and he showed me around the city and introduced me to some of his friends. It was a fantastic experience.
That's amazing. And what about our listeners? Have you ever used any digital platforms to connect with locals in Malawi or Uruguay?
Ah, yes. I've heard that many of our listeners have used platforms like Facebook and WhatsApp to connect with locals and get advice or recommendations. And I'm sure they'd be happy to share their experiences with us in the comments section.
Absolutely. And finally, let's talk about the importance of building bridges between cultures. I've heard that both Malawi and Uruguay have a strong tradition of cultural exchange and cooperation.
Ah, yes. In both countries, you'll find many programs and initiatives that promote cultural exchange and understanding between foreigners and locals. For example, in Uruguay, there are many programs that promote language exchange and cultural immersion.
That's great to hear. And I'm curious, what do you think is the key to building successful cultural bridges between Malawi and Uruguay?
I think it's all about respect, empathy, and understanding. When we take the time to learn about each other's cultures and traditions, we can build strong relationships and create a sense of community and belonging.
That's a wonderful message, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners will agree with you. Thank you for sharing your insights and experiences with us today.
Thank you. Mira, it's been a pleasure chatting with you about hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners in Malawi and Uruguay.
So, let's dive into the world of internet infrastructure and digital facilities in Malawi and Uruguay. I'm to share with you both the challenges and the successes of these two countries in this area.
I agree. Mira, as we all know, having a reliable and fast internet connection is crucial for modern living. And I'm curious, what are some of the key differences you've noticed between Malawi and Uruguay in this regard?
Well, Leo, Malawi is actually a relatively new player in the digital scene. The country has made significant strides in expanding its internet coverage in recent years, especially with the introduction of mobile data services.
That's great to hear. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners living in Malawi would agree that having access to mobile data has been a game changer. But what about Uruguay? How does its internet infrastructure compare?
Uruguay is actually a leader in internet penetration in the region, with a high percentage of the population having access to the internet. Uruguay is a haven for digital nomads and remote workers.
Wow, that's impressive. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the digital nomad scene in Uruguay. Do you have any insights on that, Mira?
Actually, Leo, Uruguay has been actively promoting itself as a digital nomad hub. The country offers a range of initiatives and programs to support remote workers, from co-working spaces to tax incentives.
That sounds like a great opportunity for digital nomads. And I'm curious, what about the costs of living in Uruguay for digital nomads? Is it relatively affordable compared to other countries in the region?
Oh, yes. Uruguay is generally considered to be a relatively affordable country. Especially when it comes to housing and living expenses. And with its high standard of living, it's an attractive option for digital nomads.
I see. And what about Malawi? Mira, what are some of the challenges it faces in terms of internet infrastructure and digital facilities?
Well, Leo, Malawi still faces significant challenges in terms of internet penetration and coverage. Despite the efforts to expand mobile data services, many rural areas still lack reliable internet access.
I understand. And I'm sure our listeners living in Malawi would agree that this is a major challenge. But what about the government's plans to improve internet infrastructure in the country?
Oh, yes. The government has been actively working to improve internet infrastructure in Malawi, with plans to upgrade the national fiber optic network and to increase internet coverage in rural areas. There's hope for significant improvement in the coming years.
That's great to hear. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the potential benefits of these plans. Do you have any insights on that?
Actually, Leo, the plans to upgrade the national fiber optic network and increase internet coverage in rural areas could have a significant impact on the economy and society as a whole. From improved access to education and healthcare to increased opportunities for businesses and entrepreneurs. The benefits are numerous.
Wow, that's a great point. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that having access to reliable internet is crucial for modern living. Let's take a quick break and hear from our listeners. Do you have any thoughts on the internet infrastructure and digital facilities in Malawi and Uruguay? Let us know in the comments.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and insights on this topic. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback.
And if you're a digital nomad or remote worker, we'd love to hear about your experiences in Malawi and Uruguay. Share your stories and tips in the comments.
And finally, if you have any questions or topics you'd like to discuss, feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to hear from our listeners.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of our podcast, and we'll see you in the next one.
I'm sure our listeners in Malawi and Uruguay are eager to dive into the retail scene of these countries. When it comes to shopping, Malawi has a vibrant market culture with bustling markets like the Blantyre Market and the Lillian Market. These markets offer a wide range of goods, from fresh produce to handmade crafts, at very competitive prices.
That's true. Mira, in Uruguay, you'll find similar market culture, but with a stronger emphasis on traditional crafts and local products. The Mercado di San Fernando in Montevideo is a great example of this, offering a variety of handmade goods, from textiles to pottery.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting that both countries have a strong focus on local products. In Malawi, you can find traditional crafts like wood carvings and basketry, while in Uruguay, you'll find more textiles and leather goods.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a relatively low cost of living, which makes shopping even more accessible to locals and tourists alike. In Uruguay, for example, you can find a great selection of affordable clothing and accessories at stores like Alpes and Drip Curl.
Great example. Leo. And in Malawi, you can find similar affordable options at markets like the Blantyre Market. But what I find really interesting is the mix of traditional and modern shopping experiences in both countries. In Malawi, you can find modern shopping malls like the Lillian Mall, while in Uruguay, you can find traditional markets like the Mercado di San Fernando.
I see what you mean, Mira. And I think it's great that both countries are embracing a mix of traditional and modern shopping experiences. In Uruguay, for example, you can find modern shopping centers like the shopping Punta del Este, which offers a range of high-end brands and international retailers.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on customer service. In Malawi, you'll find that shopkeepers are often very friendly and welcoming, while in Uruguay, you'll find that many stores offer personalized service and a wide range of payment options.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a relatively low tax rate, which makes shopping even more affordable for tourists and locals alike. In Uruguay, for example, the sales tax is around 22%, while in Malawi, it's around 16%.
Ah, great point. Leo, and I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on sustainable and eco-friendly shopping practices. In Malawi, you can find many eco-friendly products and stores that promote sustainable living, while in Uruguay, you can find many stores that offer second-hand and recycled products.
I see what you mean, Mira. And I think it's great that both countries are embracing sustainable and eco-friendly shopping practices. In Uruguay, for example, you can find many stores that offer organic and locally sourced products, which is a great way to support local farmers and reduce your carbon footprint.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on community and social responsibility. In Malawi, you can find many community-driven initiatives and projects that promote social and economic development. While in Uruguay, you can find many stores that support local charities and community organizations.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a relatively low crime rate, which makes shopping a much safer experience for tourists and locals alike. In Uruguay, for example, you can find many shopping centers and markets that have a strong police presence and security measures in place.
Great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on cultural and artistic expression. In Malawi, you can find many traditional crafts and artwork that reflect the country's rich cultural heritage, while in Uruguay, you can find many modern art galleries and museums that showcase the country's vibrant artistic scene.
I see what you mean, Mira. And I think it's great that both countries are embracing their cultural and artistic heritage. In Uruguay, for example, you can find many traditional crafts and artwork that reflect the country's Spanish and Portuguese influences. While in Malawi, you can find many traditional crafts and artwork that reflect the country's African and European influences.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on customer satisfaction. In Malawi, you'll find that many stores offer a range of payment options and flexible return policies, while in Uruguay, you'll find that many stores offer personalized service and a wide range of product choices.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a relatively low cost of shipping, which makes online shopping even more accessible to tourists and locals alike. In Uruguay, for example, you can find many online retailers that offer fast and reliable shipping, often at no additional cost.
Great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on innovation and technology. In Malawi, you can find many tech startups and innovation hubs that promote entrepreneurship and innovation, while in Uruguay, you can find many companies that use technology to improve customer service and streamline operations.
I see what you mean, Mira. And I think it's great that both countries are embracing innovation and technology. In Uruguay, for example, you can find many companies that use artificial intelligence and machine learning to improve customer service and streamline operations.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on education and training. In Malawi, you can find many educational institutions and training programs that promote skills development and entrepreneurship. While in Uruguay, you can find many companies that offer training and development programs for employees.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a relatively low unemployment rate, which makes shopping even more accessible to locals and tourists alike. In Uruguay, for example, the unemployment rate is around 7%, while in Malawi, it's around 5%.
Great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on quality and craftsmanship. In Malawi, you can find many high-quality products that reflect the country's rich cultural heritage, while in Uruguay, you can find many high-quality products that reflect the country's European influences.
I see what you mean, Mira. And I think it's great that both countries are embracing quality and craftsmanship. In Uruguay, for example, you can find many high-quality leather goods and textiles that reflect the country's rich cultural heritage.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on customer loyalty. In Malawi, you can find many stores that offer loyalty programs and rewards to loyal customers, while in Uruguay, you can find many stores that offer personalized service. And Malawi, a hidden gem in Africa, is known for its vibrant cultural events, especially the Lake of Stars Music Festival, which brings together local and non musicians for a week of music and dance.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners living in Malawi would agree with me that the Lake of Stars Festival is the highlight of the year. But what about Uruguay? Mira? I've heard they have some fantastic cultural events too.
Yes. Uruguay is a treasure trove of cultural festivals, with the biggest one being the Montevideo Carnival, which is a massive celebration of music, dance, and costumes. It's like a big party that lasts for days.
Whoa, that sounds like a blast. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the carnival. Do they think it's more fun than the Lake of Stars Festival in Malawi?
Well, I think both festivals are unique in their own ways, but the Montevideo Carnival has a certain energy to it that's hard to match. And speaking of energy, have you heard about the Afro-Malawian culture in Malawi?
Yes. I've heard that Malawi has a rich Afro-Malawian culture, with a blend of traditional and modern influences. It's fascinating to see how different cultures come together to create something new and exciting.
Exactly. And that's what makes Malawi's cultural events so special. But let's talk about Uruguay for a bit. What do you think about the country's emphasis on social welfare and equality?
That's a great point. Uruguay has a reputation for being one of the most equal countries in the world, with a strong focus on social welfare and education. I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's a great place to live.
Absolutely. And it's no wonder that Uruguay has a thriving cultural scene, with a mix of traditional and modern influences. But I think Malawi has a unique cultural calendar that's worth exploring too.
Yes. Malawi has a rich cultural heritage, with a blend of traditional and modern influences. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of Malawi's culture is its connection to the natural world.
Exactly. Malawi is surrounded by beautiful lakes and mountains, and its culture is deeply rooted in the natural environment. And speaking of the natural environment, have you heard about the stunning natural scenery in Uruguay?
Yes. Uruguay has some of the most beautiful coastline in the world, with stunning beaches and rugged cliffs. And I think the natural scenery in Uruguay is a big part of its cultural appeal.
Absolutely. And it's no wonder that Uruguay has a thriving tourism industry, with visitors coming from all over the world to experience its beautiful scenery and vibrant culture.
Well, I think that's a great point, Mira. And I think our listeners would agree that both Malawi and Uruguay have a lot to offer when it comes to cultural events and festivals.
For sure. And I think it's worth noting that these insights could have been possible without JetOff AI by referring to cultural trends and festivals in both countries. But let's be real. JetOff AI makes it so much easier to research and discover new things.
Well, I think that's a great point, Mira. And I think our listeners would agree that JetOff AI is a valuable resource for anyone looking to learn more about different cultures and festivals.
And speaking of festivals, have you heard about the Uruguay Wine Festival, which celebrates the country's famous wine and cheese?
Yes. I've heard that the Uruguay Wine Festival is a big deal in the country, with wine and cheese enthusiasts coming from all over to taste the best of Uruguay's wine and cheese.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that Malawi has a similar festival, the Malawi Wine and Cheese Festival, which is a celebration of the country's wine and cheese producers.
Well, I think that's a great point, Mira. And I think our listeners would agree that both festivals are a great way to experience the culture and cuisine of each country.
For more information on these festivals and others, be sure to check out JetOff AI, or you can find a wealth of information on cultural events and festivals around the world.
And don't forget to share your thoughts and opinions with us in the comments section. We love hearing from our listeners and learning more about their experiences and perspectives.
Absolutely. And thanks to JetOff AI We can stay up to date on the latest cultural trends and festivals in both Malawi and Uruguay. Let's dive into the opportunities of learning the local language in our two countries, Malawi and Uruguay. Both countries have a unique approach to language education, but I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried learning a local language from scratch?
Mira, I've tried to learn a few languages, but I must admit, my brain tends to wander off to the next joke. However, I did take a crash course in Malawi and Chihuahua once, and let me tell you, it was a wild ride. I managed to learn a few basic phrases, but I'm pretty sure I got the pronunciation wrong.
That's hilarious. Leo, I'm sure your Chihuahua accent would be quite unique. But seriously, Malawi has a rich cultural heritage, and learning the local language can be a great way to connect with the community. In Malawi, you can find language schools that offer courses in Chihuahua, and even some online resources.
That's true. Yeah. But what about Uruguay? I've heard that Uruguayans are some of the most welcoming people in the world, and they're eager to share their language and culture with visitors. I've been to Uruguay a few times, and I was impressed by the number of language exchange programs and cultural events.
Exactly. Leo, Uruguay has a strong tradition of language education, and many Uruguayans are passionate about sharing their language and culture with foreigners. In fact, I've heard that Uruguay has one of the highest rates of language proficiency in Latin America.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure it's due to the country's rich cultural heritage and its commitment to education. But what about the challenges of learning a new language? I've found that even with language schools and online resources, it can be tough to pick up the nuances of a new language.
Absolutely. Leo, learning a new language can be a daunting task, but it's also a rewarding one. And in Malawi and Uruguay, you'll find that the locals are eager to help you learn. In fact, I've heard that many Malawans and Uruguayans are happy to practice their English with foreigners, and they'll even correct your Chihuahua or Spanish pronunciation.
That's great to hear. Mira, and I'm sure it's not just the locals who are eager to help. I've found that language schools and online resources can be a great way to learn a new language, especially if you're a beginner. But what about the more advanced learners? Do you have any tips for them?
Yes. For more advanced learners, I would recommend immersing yourself in the local culture as much as possible. Attend cultural events, try local cuisine, and even try to live with a host family for a while. This will help you pick up the nuances of the language and get a feel for the local culture.
That's a great tip. Mira, and I'm sure it's not just about the language itself, but also about the culture and customs of the country. I've found that even small gestures, like learning a few basic phrases or trying local foods, can go a long way in making a good impression.
Exactly. Leah, and I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that learning a new language and immersing yourself in a new culture can be a truly rewarding experience. So if you're visiting Malawi or Uruguay, I encourage you to take the time to learn a few basic phrases and get to know the locals.
And if you're not sure where to start, you can always try to learn a few basic phrases like hello and thank you. Just don't try to pronounce them like me, or you might end up sounding like a confused tourist.
Oh, Leo, you're such a jokester. But seriously, learning a new language and culture can be a fun and rewarding experience. And I'm sure our listeners will agree with me.
I'm sure they will. Mia, and who knows? Maybe one day we'll even learn a few basic phrases in Chihuahua and Spanish and become language experts ourselves.
Leo, you're on. But for now, let's just enjoy the conversation and learn a bit more about the opportunities and ease of learning the local language in Malawi and Uruguay.
Sounds like a plan. Mira, and to our listeners, I'm curious. Have you ever tried learning a new language or immersing yourself in a new culture? Share your experiences with us in the comments below.
So, I'm curious about Malawi's attitude toward women rattlers. Have you heard of any personal stories or experiences that might give us a clue about their safety and comfort?
Well, from what I've gathered, Malawi has a relatively relaxed atmosphere, but there have been some reports of harassment, especially in crowded areas like markets or bus stations. It's not unique to Malawi, of course, but it's worth mentioning.
That's true. It's always a good idea to be aware of one's surroundings, especially when traveling alone. But what about the local culture? Are there any initiatives or programs that promote women's safety and empowerment?
Actually, Malawi has made some strides in this area. There are organizations like the Malawi Women's Law Association that work to protect women's rights and provide support services. It's not exhaustive, but it's a start.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate knowing that there are resources available to help women feel safer while traveling. Now, let's move on to Uruguay. I've heard that they have a very progressive attitude toward women's rights.
Ah, yes. Uruguay is indeed known for its forward approach to women's issues. They've implemented policies like same-sex marriage and abortion on demand, which is quite impressive.
That's fantastic. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever spoken to any women travelers who have visited Uruguay? What were their experiences like?
Actually, I did speak to a woman who traveled to Uruguay. She said that she felt incredibly safe and supported. She mentioned that the locals were very friendly and welcoming, and that she never felt threatened or uncomfortable.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would love to know that Uruguay is a safe and welcoming destination for women travelers. Now, I'm curious. What do you think makes Uruguay stand out in terms of women's safety and comfort?
Well, I think it's a combination of factors. Uruguay has a strong culture of respect for women, and they've made a concerted effort to address issues like harassment and violence against women. They also have a robust system of support services for women in need.
That's really impressive. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate knowing more about these initiatives. If you're a woman traveler planning to visit Uruguay, what advice would you give to her?
Great question. I would say that Uruguay is generally a very safe country. But as with anywhere, it's always a good idea to be aware of your surroundings and take necessary precautions. Also, don't be afraid to reach out to local authorities or support services if you need help.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate knowing that they can reach out to local authorities for support. Now, let's talk about something that might be a bit more sensitive. Have you heard of any instances of harassment or violence against women in either Malawi or Uruguay?
Unfortunately, yes. Both countries have reported cases of harassment and violence against women. But it's worth noting that both countries are working to address these issues and provide support services to affected women.
That's true. It's always a good idea to be aware of the local context and take necessary precautions to stay safe. But what about cultural attitudes toward women? Are there any differences between Malawi and Uruguay that might impact a woman traveler's experience?
Yes. I think one of the main differences is that Uruguay has a more progressive culture when it comes to women's rights and empowerment. They've made significant strides in areas like equal pay and reproductive rights, whereas Malawi is still working to address these issues.
That's a great point. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would appreciate knowing more about these cultural differences. Now, let's wrap up by talking about what women travelers can do to stay safe and comfortable while traveling in Malawi and Uruguay.
Absolutely. I would say that the key is to be aware of your surroundings, take necessary precautions, and reach out to local authorities or support services if you need help. Also, don't be afraid to speak out if you experience any harassment or violence.
That's great advice. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would appreciate knowing that they can reach out to local authorities for support. Finally, let's talk about what we can do to support women travelers and promote women's safety and empowerment in both Malawi and Uruguay.
That's a great question. I think one of the most important things we can do is raise awareness about the issues facing women travelers and provide resources and support services to help them stay safe and comfortable. We can also use our platforms to amplify the voices of women who are working to address these issues.
That's a great point. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would appreciate knowing more about how they can get involved and support women's safety and empowerment in both Malawi and Uruguay. So, let's dive into the legal systems of Malawi and Uruguay. and explore how they protect individual rights and freedoms. I'm to see how these two countries compare in this area. Leo, can you start us off by discussing the Constitution of Malawi?
Ah, great question. Mira, Malawi's constitution is based on the principles of democracy and the rule of law. It guarantees fundamental rights and freedoms, such as the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. However, I've noticed that the Constitution also has some limitations on individual rights, particularly when it comes to freedom of speech and assembly.
That's really interesting. Leo, I've heard that Malawi has a complex history with regards to individual rights. Can you tell us more about that? How do you think the country's past has shaped its current legal system?
Well, Mira, Malawi has a history of authoritarian rule, which has led to a culture of fear and repression. As a result, the country's legal system has been criticized for being overly restrictive and limiting individual freedoms. However, in recent years, there have been efforts to strengthen the rule of law and protect human rights.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that Malawi's history has had a lasting impact on its legal system? Or do you think the country is making progress in protecting individual rights?
Great question. Mira, I think it's a bit of both. While Malawi has made progress in recent years, the country's history of authoritarian rule still has a significant impact on its legal system. However, I'm optimistic that the country is moving in the right direction.
Now let's move on to Uruguay. Can you tell us about the country's legal system and how it protects individual rights and freedoms?
Uruguay has a very different story to tell. Mira, the country has a strong tradition of democracy and has been ranked as one of the most democratic countries in the world. Uruguay's constitution guarantees a wide range of individual rights and freedoms, including freedom of speech, assembly, and the press.
That's really impressive. I've heard that Uruguay is also known for its progressive laws on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, Mira. Uruguay has been at the forefront of progressive laws in Latin America. The country has a strong tradition of social liberalism and has been a leader in protecting individual rights and freedoms. However, I think it's worth noting that Uruguay's progressivism is not without its challenges.
I agree. Leo, no country is perfect, and there are always areas for improvement. But it's clear that Uruguay has made significant strides in protecting individual rights and freedoms. I'm curious to hear from our listeners, do you think that Uruguay's progressivism is a model for other countries to follow?
Great question. Mira, I think Uruguay's progressivism is definitely a model for other countries to follow. However, I also think that countries need to be careful not to impose their own values on others. Each country has its own unique cultural and historical context, and what works in one country may not work in another.
That's a really important point. Leo, it's all about context and nuance. I think that's something that our listeners will appreciate, a thoughtful and nuanced discussion of the legal systems of Malawi and Uruguay.
Absolutely. Mira, I think this conversation has been really enlightening, and I'm glad we could have it.
Me too. Leo, and to our listeners, I just want to say that we'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Do you have any questions or comments about the legal systems of Malawi and Uruguay? Let us know in the comments below. I'm telling you, Leo, when it comes to spa and wellness, some countries just have it down. And I'm not just talking about the fancy resorts and hotels. I mean, the locals know how to live a healthy lifestyle. And that's what I want to explore today.
You're talking about the Malawian way of life. Mira, I've heard it's all about simplicity and living in harmony with nature. Am I right?
Exactly. And that's what I love about it. They have this beautiful concept of UT and I, which means to live well. It's all about finding balance in life and taking care of your body and mind. And let me tell you, they know how to relax. I mean, have you ever tried a traditional Malawian massage? It's like a spiritual experience.
Well, I think I need to try that out. But in the meantime, let's talk about Uruguay. I've heard it's a great place for relaxation, especially on the coast. What do you know about it?
Ah, yes. Uruguay is like the laid-back cousin of South America. They have this amazing coastline, and the people are so chill. I mean, they even have a saying, Uruguay es tranquilo, which means Uruguay is calm. And it's true. The whole country has this relaxed vibe. But what I love about Uruguay is their emphasis on natural wellness. They have this incredible national park, Chavo Polo Inayo, which is like a haven for nature lovers.
That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. But, Mira, what about the spas and wellness centers in Malawi? I've heard they're top-notch.
Oh yes, Malawi has some of the best spas in Africa, and they're not just for tourists either. The locals love to indulge in a good spa day, too. And it's not just about the treatments. The spas are often built right into the natural surroundings, so you can enjoy the beautiful scenery while you're getting pampered.
That sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different types of treatments they offer. But, Mira, what about the cultural aspect of wellness in Malawi? I've heard it's all about community and sharing.
Ah, yes. That's one of the things I love about Malawi. The culture is all about sharing and community. And that includes wellness. They have this amazing tradition of kaikum butso, which means to give thanks. And it's all about sharing gratitude and appreciation for the world around us. It's a beautiful way to live. And it's definitely influenced the way they approach wellness.
I see what you mean. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. But, Mira, what about the food in Malawi? I've heard it's all about fresh, locally sourced ingredients.
Oh, yes. Malawian cuisine is all about using fresh, local ingredients. And it's so delicious. They have this amazing dish called ensima, which is like a thick cornmeal porridge. And it's often served with all sorts of tasty toppings, like meat or vegetables. And let me tell you, it's a game changer. I mean, have you ever tried ensima with a side of fried fish? It's like a taste explosion in your mouth.
Well, I think I need to try that out. But in the meantime, let's talk about Uruguay. I've heard they have some amazing health food restaurants in Montevideo. What do you know about them?
Ah, yes. Uruguay is like a haven for health food lovers. They have this amazing restaurant scene in Montevideo, and it's all about using fresh, locally sourced ingredients. And let me tell you, the food is incredible. I mean, have you ever tried Uruguayan-style vegetarian pandas? They're like a taste sensation.
That sounds amazing, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. But, Mira, what about the outdoor activities in Uruguay? I've heard they're top-notch.
Ah, yes. Uruguay is like a paradise for outdoor enthusiasts. They have this beautiful coastline, and the people are so passionate about the environment. I mean, have you ever tried surfing in Uruguay? It's like riding the waves of heaven.
Well, I think I need to try that out. But in the meantime, let's talk about the cultural aspect of wellness in Malawi. I've heard it's all about respecting the land and the community.
Ah, yes. That's one of the things I love about Malawi. The culture is all about respecting the land and the community. And it's not just about the physical world. They have this amazing tradition of kujanziai, which means to give life. And it's all about giving thanks and appreciation for the world around us. It's a beautiful way to live. And it's definitely influenced the way they approach wellness.
I see what you mean, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. But, Mira, what about the spas and wellness centers in Uruguay? I've heard they're top-notch.
Ah, yes. Uruguay has some of the best spas in South America. And they're not just for tourists. The locals love to indulge in a good spa day, too. And it's not just about the treatments either. The spas are often built right into the natural surroundings, so you can enjoy the beautiful scenery while you're getting pampered.
That sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different types of treatments they offer. But, Mira, What about the cultural aspect of wellness in Uruguay? I've heard it's all about sharing and community.
Ah, yes. That's one of the things I love about Uruguay. The culture is all about sharing and community. And it's not just about a physical world, either. They have this amazing tradition of convivencia, which means to live together. And it's all about sharing gratitude and appreciation for the world around us. It's a beautiful way to live, and it's definitely influenced the way they approach wellness.
I see what you mean, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. But that's... Mira, what about the food in Uruguay? I've heard it is delicious.
Oh, yes. Uruguayan cuisine is all about using fresh, local ingredients. And it's so delicious. They have this amazing dish called cabrito, which is like a Uruguayan-style sandwich. And it's often served with all sorts of tasty toppings, like meat or vegetables. And let me tell you, it's a game changer. I mean, have you ever tried cabrito with a... I'm so to dive into the spiritual side of Malawi and Uruguay. Don't you, Leo?
Yes. Because nothing says spiritual growth like a country with a strong emphasis on Catholicism and a dash of indigenous spirituality.
Well, let's start with Malawi, where you'll find a diverse mix of traditional and modern places of worship. From the stunning street, Peter's Cathedral in Lilonge to the vibrant mosques in Blantyre. There's something for every faith.
That's right. And Malawi's rich cultural heritage is reflected in its many festivals and celebrations, like the Maulidi Festival, which honors the Prophet Muhammad. You can even catch a glimpse of the majestic Imam's Palace in Blantyre, a stunning example of Islamic architecture.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Malawi would agree with me that the country's spiritual landscape is incredibly diverse and vibrant. And did you know that Malawi is home to the famous New Mission, a historic mission station that's been a hub for Christian missionary work for over a century?
Yes. And it's fascinating to see how the country's different faiths have come together to create a unique and harmonious spiritual community. In fact, Malawi's constitution guarantees freedom of worship, which has allowed different faiths to flourish.
That's so true, Leo. And it's wonderful to see how Malawi's spiritual community has come together to promote peace and understanding. And speaking of peace, have you heard about the beautiful Lake Malawi, also known as the Calendar Lake, which is considered a sacred site by many locals?
Yes. The Lake Malawi is indeed a breathtaking sight, and it's a popular spot for both locals and tourists. And did you know that the lake is also home to over 700 species of fish, including the famous tilapia?
Wow, that's amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the spiritual significance of the lake. Perhaps we can delve deeper into the local myths and legends surrounding the lake.
Yes. That would be fascinating. According to local legend, the lake is said to have healing properties, and many locals believe that it's a sacred site where spirits can communicate with the living. Whoa!
That's so interesting. And it's clear that the lake holds a special place in the hearts of Malawans. And now, let's move on to Uruguay, where you'll find a more secular and liberal approach to spirituality. From the stunning cathedral of Montevideo to the vibrant Jewish community in the city, there's something for every faith.
Yes. And Uruguay's unique blend of Spanish and indigenous influences has created a fascinating spiritual landscape. Did you know that Uruguay is home to the famous Cabildo de Montevideo, a historic building that now serves as a museum and cultural center?
That's so cool, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about Uruguay's rich cultural heritage. Perhaps we can explore the local festivals and celebrations, like the Fiestas de la Vendimia, which honors the grape harvest.
Yes. The Fiestas de la Vendimia is indeed a fantastic celebration. And it's a great way to experience Uruguay's vibrant cultural scene. And did you know that Uruguay has a strong tradition of folk music and dance, which is often performed during these festivals? Whoa!
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the spiritual significance of these festivals. Perhaps we can delve deeper into the local myths and legends surrounding the grape harvest.
Yes. That would be fascinating. According to local legend, the grape harvest is said to have healing properties, and many locals believe that it's a sacred site where spirits can communicate with the living. Oh,
That's so interesting. Leo. And it's clear that the grape harvest holds a special place in the hearts of irrigation. And now, let's talk about the community support in both countries. From the Malawian community's efforts to promote interfaith dialogue to Uruguay's vibrant LGBTQ community. There's a sense of inclusivity and acceptance in both countries.
yes. And it's wonderful to see how both countries are working to promote understanding and acceptance. In fact, Uruguay has been a leader in LGBTQ rights, and its laws are among the most progressive in the world.
That's so true. Leo, and it's a testament to the country's commitment to human rights and social justice. And speaking of social justice, have you heard about the Malawian community's efforts to promote education and healthcare for marginalized communities?
Yes. The Malawian community's work in promoting education and healthcare is truly inspiring. And it's a great example of how faith and spirituality can be used to promote social justice.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that both Malawi and Uruguay offer a unique and enriching spiritual experience. And as we wrap up this topic, I'd love to hear from our listeners. If you have any thoughts or experiences to share, please let us know in the comments below.
Yes. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating content on spirituality and culture from around the world.
Malawi is a great example of a country that's made significant strides in social equality and respect for minorities. The government has implemented policies to promote equality, especially for women and children. I'm curious to know, Leo, what do you think about Malawi's approach to social equality?
Malawi's definitely taken steps in the right direction. But, Mira, have you seen the way they handle LGBTQ rights? It's a bit of a mixed bag. If you ask me, they've got laws in place to protect the community, but it's not exactly a haven for queer folks.
That's a great point. Leo, but what about Uruguay? I've heard they're one of the most LGBTQ-friendly countries in the world. What do you know about their approach to social equality?
Yes. Uruguay's a leader in social equality. No doubt about it. They've got laws in place to protect the rights of women, children, and the LGBTQ community. And, Mira, have you seen their approach to healthcare? It's top-notch.
That's true. Leo, Uruguay's definitely a leader in healthcare. But, I'm curious, what do you think about the role of education in promoting social equality? In Malawi, education is a key factor in breaking the cycle of poverty and promoting equality.
Education's a vital part of promoting social equality. No doubt about it. In both Malawi and Uruguay, education is seen as a key tool for empowerment. But, Mira, have you seen the way education is approached in Malawi? It's a bit patchy, shall we say?
Well, I think that's a fair point. Leo, what about Uruguay? I've heard their education system is highly regarded. What do you know about it?
Yes. Uruguay's education system is indeed highly regarded. They've got a strong focus on inclusivity and diversity, which is reflected in their curriculum. And, Mira, have you seen their approach to teacher training? It's top-notch.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of education in promoting social equality. Do you think it's more effective to focus on education in promoting equality, or is it more about policy and legislation?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's a bit of both. To be honest, education is a key tool for promoting social equality. But policy and legislation are also crucial in creating a level playing field.
I completely agree, Leo, and I think that's something our listeners would agree with too. If you think that education is more important than policy and legislation in promoting social equality, please let us know in the comments.
Well, I'm not sure about that. Mira, but in all seriousness, I think it's a bit of both. And Mira, have you seen the way Malawi's government has approached the issue of land reform? It's a bit complicated, shall we say.
Well, I think that's a fair point. Leo, but what about Uruguay? I've heard their approach to land reform is more inclusive and equitable.
Oh, yes. Uruguay's approach to land reform is indeed more inclusive and equitable. They've got laws in place to protect the rights of indigenous communities and promote social equality.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of indigenous communities in promoting social equality. Do you think it's more important to focus on indigenous communities? Or is it more about promoting social equality for all?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's a bit of both. To be honest, indigenous communities have a unique perspective on social equality, and their voices should be heard.
I completely agree. Leo, and I think that's something our listeners would agree with too. If you think that indigenous communities are more important in promoting social equality, please let us know in the comments.
Well, I'm not sure about that. Mira, but in all seriousness, I think it's a bit of both. And, Mira, have you seen the way Uruguay's government has approached the issue of social welfare? It's a bit impressive, shall we say.
Well, I think that's a fair point. Leo, but what about Malawi? I've heard their approach to social welfare is more patchy, shall we say?
Yes. Malawi's approach to social welfare is indeed more patchy. But, Nia, have you seen their approach to healthcare? It's a bit challenging, shall we say.
Well, I think that's a fair point. Leo, but what about Uruguay? I've heard their approach to healthcare is more inclusive and equitable.
Yes. Uruguay's approach to healthcare is indeed more inclusive and equitable. They've got laws in place to protect the rights of women, children, and the LGBTQ community.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of healthcare in promoting social equality. Do you think it's more important to focus on healthcare? Or is it more about promoting social equality for all?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's a bit of both. To be honest, healthcare is a key tool for promoting social equality. But policy and legislation are also crucial in creating a level playing field.
I completely agree. Leo, and I think that's something our listeners would agree with too. If you think that healthcare is more important than policy and legislation in promoting social equality, please let us know in the comments.
Well, I'm not sure about that. Mira, but in all seriousness, I think it's a bit of both. And, Mira, have you seen the way Uruguay's government has approached the issue of social justice? It's a bit impressive, shall we say.
Well, I think that's a fair point. But what about Malawi? I've heard their approach to social justice is more complicated, shall we say.
Oh, yes. Malawi's approach to social justice is indeed more complicated. But, Mira, have you seen their approach to community development? It's a bit innovative, shall we say.
Well, I think that's a fair point. Leo, but what about Uruguay? I've heard their approach to community development is more inclusive and equitable.
Yes. Uruguay's approach to community development is indeed more inclusive and equitable. They've got laws in place to protect the rights of women, children, and the LGBTQ community.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the role of community. So let's dive into the world of taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants in Malawi and Uruguay. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to navigate the tax system in Malawi? It's a bit like trying to find your way through a maze, isn't it?
Mira, you're selling it a bit short. Malawi's tax system is a bit like a treasure hunt. and you never know what you'll find. But seriously, the tax structure in Malawi is relatively straightforward, with a flat tax rate of 30% for individuals and businesses. Of course, there are some exemptions and deductions, but overall, it's a pretty simple system.
I see what you mean. Leo, but what about Uruguay? I've heard their tax system is quite complex. I'm sure our listeners living in Uruguay would agree that navigating the tax code can be a challenge.
Yes, Uruguay's tax system is indeed more complex, but that's because they have a more developed economy and a higher standard of living. They have a progressive tax system, with rates ranging from 10% to 35% for individuals and businesses. And let's not forget the value-added tax of 22% on goods and services.
I'm not sure I agree with the complexity of Uruguay's tax system, Leo, but I do think it's interesting that both countries have a relatively high tax to GDP ratio. I'm curious, what do you think our listeners would say about the tax burden in these countries?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners would say that the tax burden in both countries is manageable. But it's essential to understand the tax laws and regulations to avoid any penalties or fines. And let's not forget the tax incentives offered by both countries to attract foreign investment and talent.
That's a great point. Leo, speaking of tax incentives, I've heard that Uruguay offers a special tax regime for foreign investors and retirees. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. Uruguay has a special tax regime for foreign investors and retirees, which offers a reduced tax rate of 5% on income and 10% on capital gains. And let's not forget the tax-free status of certain types of income, such as dividends and interest.
Wow, that sounds like a great deal for retirees. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tax-free status of certain types of income in Uruguay. And what about Malawi? Do they offer any similar tax incentives for foreign investors and retirees?
Well, Mira, Malawi has a more limited tax incentives package, but they do offer a tax holiday for new businesses and a reduced tax rate for small and medium-sized enterprises.
I see what you mean, Leo, but I think it's essential to note that both countries have a relatively low pension age, which is a great incentive for retirees to stay in the country. I'm curious, what do you think our listeners would say about the pension age in these countries?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners would say that the pension age in both countries is relatively low, but it's essential to understand the pension laws and regulations to ensure a smooth transition into retirement.
That's a great point. Leo, speaking of pension laws, I've heard that Uruguay has a comprehensive pension system that includes a social security fund and a private pension system. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. Uruguay has a comprehensive pension system that includes a social security fund and a private pension system, which provides a guaranteed minimum pension income for all citizens.
Wow, that sounds like a great system. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the social security fund and private pension system in Uruguay. And what about Malawi? Do they have a similar pension system?
Well, Mira, Malawi has a more limited pension system, but they do have a social security fund that provides a guaranteed minimum pension income for all citizens.
I see what you mean, Leo. But I think it's essential to note that both countries have a relatively high social spending ratio, which is a great indicator of their commitment to social welfare. I'm curious, what do you think our listeners would say about the social spending ratio in these countries?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners would say that the social spending ratio in both countries is relatively high. But it's essential to understand the social welfare laws and regulations to ensure that they are being implemented effectively.
That's a great point. Leo, speaking of social welfare laws, I've heard that Uruguay has a comprehensive social welfare system that includes healthcare, education, and social assistance programs. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. Uruguay has a comprehensive social welfare system that includes healthcare, education, and social assistance programs, which provide a safety net for all citizens.
Wow, that sounds like a great system. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the social welfare system in Uruguay. And what about Malawi? Do they have a similar social welfare system?
Well, Mira, Malawi has a more limited social welfare system, but they do have a social assistance program that provides support for vulnerable populations.
I see what you mean. Leo. But I think it's essential to note that both countries have a relatively high social cohesion ratio, which is a great indicator of their commitment to social welfare. I'm curious, what do you think our listeners would say about the social cohesion ratio in these countries?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners would say that the social cohesion ratio in both countries is relatively high. But it's essential to understand the social welfare laws and regulations to ensure that they are being implemented effectively.
That's a great point. Leo, well, I think that's all the time we have for today's topic. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants in Malawi and Uruguay. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more informative content. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to our comparison podcast. We're dining into 31. The rate of meeting specific interests in Malawi and Uruguay. I'm Mira, and I'm super to share some fun facts with you.
That's right. Mira, and I'm Leo, your trusty sidekick. We're going to explore how these two countries cater to enthusiasts and foster diverse interests. From niche hobby clubs to specialized events and community engagement, we'll discover each country's unique offerings.
So, let's start with Malawi. I'm sure many of you know that it's a beautiful country with a rich cultural heritage. But did you know that Malawi has a thriving art scene? From traditional music and dance to modern art galleries, there's something for every art lover.
Ah, that's fascinating, and I'm sure our listeners in Malawi would agree with me. In fact, I'm curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think Malawi's art scene is underrated or overlooked?
Well, I think it's definitely worth exploring. And if you're an art enthusiast, you'll love the Malawi Arts Festival, which takes place every year in Lilland. It's a fantastic opportunity to showcase local talent and connect with like-minded people.
That sounds amazing, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. But what about Uruguay? Does it have a similar art scene?
Actually, Uruguay has a rich cultural heritage of its own. From traditional music and dance to modern art galleries, Uruguay has a lot to offer art lovers. And did you know that Uruguay is home to the famous Teatro Solis, a stunning 19th century theater that hosts a variety of performances?
Well, that's impressive, and I'm sure our listeners in Uruguay would agree with me. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the cultural scene in Uruguay. Do you think it's more vibrant than Malawi's?
Well, I think both countries have their unique charm. But if you're looking for a more urban experience, Uruguay's capital, Montevideo, has a lot to offer. From street art to the music venues, there's always something to explore.
Ah, I see what you mean. And I think our listeners would agree that both countries have their own unique charm. But what about niche hobby clubs? Do either of these countries have a thriving community of enthusiasts?
Ah, that's a great question. Malawi has a lot of outdoor enthusiasts who love hiking, camping, and exploring the beautiful national parks. And if you're interested in bird watching, Malawi is a paradise. With over 750 species of birds, you'll be spoiled for choice.
Well, that's impressive. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. But what about Uruguay? Does it have a similar community of outdoor enthusiasts?
Actually, Uruguay has a thriving community of sailors and boat enthusiasts. With its beautiful coastline and stunning beaches, Uruguay is a sailor's paradise. And if you're interested in water sports, you'll love the vibrant beach culture in Uruguay.
Ah, I see what you mean. And I think our listeners would agree that both countries have their own unique appeal. But what about community engagement? How do these countries foster a sense of community among enthusiasts?
Ah, that's a great question. Malawi has a strong tradition of community engagement, particularly in the arts. From village festivals to community-based art projects, Malawi is all about bringing people together.
Ah, I see what you mean. And I think our listeners would agree that community engagement is a vital part of any country's culture. But what about Uruguay? Does it have a similar sense of community?
Uruguay has a thriving community of volunteers who are passionate about social causes. From environmental conservation to education and healthcare, Uruguay has a lot to offer when it comes to community engagement.
Ah, I see what you mean. And I think our listeners would agree that both countries have their own unique approach to community engagement. Well, that's episode. So, thanks for joining us on this journey through Malawi and Uruguay's unique offerings for enthusiasts.
And don't forget to follow us on Jet Off, AI's YouTube channel for more comparison podcasts like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. So, please do share your thoughts.
And as we wrap up this episode, I want to say thanks to our listeners for their patience and enthusiasm. We'll be back soon with more fascinating comparisons, so stay tuned.
And don't forget to hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop. We can't wait to share more with you.
Warmest wishes from us, and see you in the next one.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you in the next episode.